Victory is celebrated in the light, but it is won in the darkness. A key element of what the sisterhood believes leads to the betterment of the Imperium. Man, I am beyond excited to begin my coverage of being back in this world that I'm beyond a fan of, and that is the world of Dune. Now, this video will serve as a scene-by-scene breakdown of Dune Prophecy Episode 1 titled The Hidden Hand. Now, before we get started, I want to establish a baseline of what you all should expect from this video. Now, I'm coming into this show as someone who loves both films directed by Denis Villeneuve, and I love the world that Frank Herbert has created, and I'm very aware of its influence on the sci-fi genre as a whole. Now, I've also seen the David Lynch film, and I appreciate that film for what it is, but I say all that to say I have not read any of the books at all, and I'm aware of some of the more trippy elements that come from the books, and also know some of the future storylines that happens in the books, but by no means will I call myself an expert when it comes to the overall world of Dune. So, this breakdown is coming from a fan of the films with little to no knowledge of the books, so please don't expect me to call out all the different Easter eggs or dive in deeper into the story history books of this world. So this breakdown is coming from the perspective of someone looking at the characters, sharing my thoughts on the writing, and basing my opinions or theories on what the show gives us. So there will not be any book spoilers from me. By all means, you all can share your thoughts if you have read the books to kind of give us like what we can expect with this series, but again, all of my opinions and my thoughts and my theories will be solely based on the individual episodes that are given to us. Now, with that beyond the way, let's talk about this episode and get into my breakdown. Full spoilers ahead. As we flash back to a time when humans defeated the thinking machines, and it was said that an Atreides led them to victory when the war ended. We hear that the Harkonnens were banished for being cowards and sent to a desolate world. As we are introduced to Valia Harkonnen, who sets her sights on changing the history books that apparently the Atreides lied about. Now, going back to my fandom of the movies, it is very apparent that the Harkonnens and the Atreides have been mortal enemies for centuries, and it will be very interesting to get this series from a Harkonnen point of view. I also have to point out that Mass Effect / Halo opening battle that we got there. Am I the only person that would be interested in seeing like another spin-off series or maybe even a movie about the rise of the thinking machines and seeing the lead up to the battle and see if it was indeed an Atreides that did win the war? Now, instead of being beholden by the shaman of her family's name, we see that Valia Harkonnen chose a new family made up of women unafraid of their powers. As we meet our first Mother Superior by the name of Rhaekella, who was a war hero who taught the sisters to work as truthsayers, as they would be assigned to the great houses to help sift the truth from the lies. Now, based on the trailers, I guess I was under the assumption that we were going to be seeing like the very true beginnings of the sisterhood, but as is shown in this scene, they were already undergoing their practices. Again, it seems like the time before the war and during the war, and meeting and learning about characters like Rhaekella seems like a show within itself that could maybe be explored at a later point in time. After seeing the flaws in these people in power, we see to combat this, the Mother Superior secretly created this project to breed better leaders and foster the right royal unions to cultivate leaders that they can control, which is obviously something that we saw in the Dune movies. Now, some of the sisters disagree with this method, and we see that this decision created a divide amongst the sisters, as we later see that some felt that this went against their values and their beliefs. On the home planet of the sisterhood, we see that the Mother Superior is on her deathbed and she's seeking to speak with Valia. Now, after the room was cleared, we see that the sister mother speaks about this red dust and that this Terran Arafel is coming. Now, after briefly looking this up, it appears that this is a cloud of darkness of holy judgment, or a cloud of darkness at the end of the universe, and it is the end of mankind, which is something that we see in the vision throughout this episode. Now, again, knowing the very little that I know that is coming in Dune Messiah, I would wonder if the reckoning is what's to come with Paul Atreides becoming the Emperor. Now, I wonder if the show is introducing this concept in this series, which again, I know this concept comes from the books, but I wonder, for those that haven't read the books like myself, if this does happen in the movies like a Dune Messiah or maybe another Dune story, the audience will have a sense of the concept to better understand it now versus it being introduced in the film and people might be being confused on what it actually means. Now, in this reckoning, we see a sandworm arriving to eat whatever stands in its way. We see shots of blood, we see burnt bodies, and we see the vastness in space, and there's this blue light that that appears to be speaking. After this vision, we see that Valia is told to grow the sisterhood, safeguarding the powers, and to use every tool, or else they will fall, and she will be the one to see the burning truth and know. Now, it's important to remember the word burning that she spoke of, because later in this episode, we see two characters die after being burned alive, and that appears to be from the vision. Now, we see that Valia discusses this prophecy with the other sisters, and they describe it as a holy judgment brought down by a tyrant. Again, will the same prophecy come true with Paul Atreides? Now, to prevent this reckoning from happening, we see that Valia suggested they put one of their own, a sister on a throne, to become the first empress to rule the Imperium. Now, at the Superior Mother's burial, we see the sisterhood beginning to take sides on what they believe their future is going to look like. We see that Mother Dotea seeks to put an end to the breeding project to bring back the values of the sisterhood. Now, Valia is ultimately chosen to lead the sisterhood after Superior Mother's death, but Mother Dotea is determined to end this project, but Valia stops her by using the voice on her for the very first time, a skill that she says that she's been working on and she wants to share with her at a later time, and she promises to continue to show her these skills if she bends the knee to her. Now, Mother Dotea refuses, which leads to Valia forcing her to take her own life, as she says, sisterhood above all. Now, of course, based on the trailer, I'm to assume that we're going to get more scenes of young Valia, especially to see how she came to learn of the voice and where the power actually stems from, because we don't see anyone else using it for the rest of the episode. Now, to speak briefly to these opening sequences, there was a lot to take in, but it's pretty easy enough to follow along to understand what was established. There's a reckoning coming, and our lead character, Valia, believes that she is the one that can prevent this from happening and protect her sisterhood, but after killing one of her own, it seems that her own aspirations will come before her sisterhood, which in my opinion could lead to this iteration of sisterhood meeting their demise. Now, we flash forward 30 years later from the opening scene and 116 years after the Great Machine War and over 10,000 years before Paul Atreides is born, as we see this new era led by the Mother Superior Valia. Now, we see under her guidance, she's the one who decides which sisters are chosen to be truthsayers for the royal families. Now, interesting enough, we see that she declines her own family's name after they requested a sister for the 4th time. Now, later on in this episode, we actually see a Harkonnen, but they don't seem nearly as powerful nor as menacing as we've seen them in the films, so it seems that she may have disowned like a section of her family because they lack power or respect from the great houses, and maybe to some, they're still considered to be cowards after being banished after the war won against the thinking machines. Now, we see the sisters in training see the princess's half-brother Constantine, and we learn that he has no claim to the throne as he's here to finalize a decision on if the princess will be allowed to learn the ways of the sisterhood and become a truthsayer for the next 10 years. Now, obviously, this harkens back to the plan that was created on the night of the Superior Mother's death, and that's having one of their own on the Golden Iron Throne. Now, the princess will not be given any special privileges after Constantine tries to half-heartedly demand that she have her own quarters, but it gets declined. But this doesn't change anything because we see this meeting doesn't last too much longer, as it is confirmed that she will be joining the sisterhood in about a week or so. Now, personally, I don't think sending Constantine here was meant as a sign of him being taken seriously or him actually making demands, but I believe whether it was his father or his mother, I think they just want him to make something of himself. They want him to be taken seriously to a certain extent, and they want him to have purpose, because it's never explained if he was born of wedlock or if the emperor or the empress had an affair out of marriage and he's looked at as like a bastard child, which explains why he doesn't have a claim to the throne. Now, we get this quick scene that shows the differences of opinion between the two sisters, Valia and her younger sister, Tula, as they're showing the trainees this reading and knowing how to tell the difference between the lies and how they can take advantage of lies, which throughout this episode, we see that Tula is pushing back against her sister at points, not to a strong degree, but enough to know that there is some disagreements that they have, and they've had since they were probably kids. And to me, this points out a future storyline of their relationship slowly becoming more and more complicated. Now, from here, we venture off into the planet Salusa Secundus, which is the home world of the Imperial House. Here's where we officially meet the princess who's training with Kieran, who is the sword master, as the princess shows Constantine the skills she's learned so far. Meanwhile, we're introduced to Emperor Carino, who's conducting a marriage arrangement between his daughter Nez and House Rashani's 9-year-old son. Now, this marriage is believed to strengthen the Imperium as they're gifted a new fleet that will deal with the issues on Arrakis, which involve stealing of the spice imports. Now, during this conversation, we see that the sisters are at work because these two leaders of their respective houses, including the Emperor himself, think that they are in control of this situation as they're going back and forth with the details, but we see that the two sisters that represent their houses are the actual ones brokering this arrangement and controlling this situation as the marriage is agreed upon. Now, we see that the Empress is not fond of her daughter becoming a sister, nor is she happy with this arrangement of marriage. Now, on the other hand, we see that Nez is very happy with this arrangement because of the young age of her husband allows her to be in control. While he's aging up, she'll be able to keep her secret relationship going on with the Swordmaster. Which, speaking of, we see that the Swordmaster Kieran telling the Emperor of the arrival of a soldier who survived a recent attack on Arrakis by the name of Desmond Hart. We learn that he's a decorated soldier who's here to tell the truth about why he's the sole survivor of the attack. Now, he informs the Emperor that the Fremen weren't responsible for wiping out his regiment and instilling the spice, but instead claims that it came from these insurgents from their allied worlds trained in their ways. Now, Kesha, who serves as the Emperor Truthsayer, she uses her abilities and tells the Emperors that the story is true, or at least that he believes it to be true. Hart gets granted access to stay for a little bit longer and gets invited to the party that's going to be taking place later that night as Kesha senses something after meeting Hart. Now, it appears that Hart's arrival caused some type of distress or disruption because Kesha feels some sense of presence. As we see Kesha having a vision which sees the princess above her in the mouth of a sandworm and wearing a red dress with blood trailing after her, and we see this rotten fruit and she's blaming Kesha as she gets consumed by the sandworm, and that same blue light from the superior mother's visions comes back up in this vision as well. As it seems that the marriage is forbidden, or at the very least is the beginning of the reckoning. Now, we only get one actual scene between Kesha and Nez, but it's very clear that Kesha cares for her and she says her goodbyes, as this will be the last time they actually speak, and she gives her a kiss on the forehead. I don't think Kesha knew that this was going to be the last time she was going to speak to the Princess Nez, but I do definitely think that she knew that if she didn't stop this marriage from happening, that something bad was going to come from those nightmares, and she tries to prevent this from happening and keeping Nez safe at the same time, which obviously contradicts the plan that the sisterhoods have. Now, the only scene that we get between husband and wife, the Empress and the Emperor, again, we learn that she is not pleased with this wedding, and she's also not a fan of the sisterhood, and she mentions that their marriage hasn't been as strong after the Emperor started taking advice from the sisterhood and wasn't listening to her. So it's very clear that there is a history there, and I'm really excited to kind of explore that history again. What's the deal with Constantine? Was that a bastard kid? And I'm just really excited to see, when did the rift happen between these two? When did the sisterhood get advised to the Emperor, and what did change in their relationship? Something, again, that I'm excited to explore more of. Now, back on the homeworld of the sisterhood, we witness them in training, and we see them in combat, them in reign, testing their strength and weaknesses. We also see them practicing their truth-saying abilities against criminals. And again, the show puts an emphasis on this particular sister, Lila. Now, in the combat scenes, we also see that she's not as strong as the others. For example, we meet Jen, who seems to be skilled in combat, and she may be a good liar as well, as she tells her story that we later find out wasn't entirely true about her past as a child. But again, I see the show setting up both characters in this particular scene as important characters moving forward in the overall story. Now, we see Valia and her sister Tula looking over candidates to pair with the princess on her training. They want someone that they can trust, but more importantly, someone they can keep in line. Now, we see both sisters have their own favorites within the sisterhood, and again, we see that sister Layla comes up, and Valia believes that she's a lamb lost in the woods. Now, Tula mentions because of her family lineage that she is a natural truth-sayer, but Valia again sees her as only being weak. Again, they definitely seem to be setting up Lila as someone to emerge as a key character, to be the opposite of what she's looked at, which is being weak. Now, Sister Kesha arrives and shares her recent nightmare and expresses her concerns about Nez joining the sisterhood. It's in this scene that we see just how much they scheme, as we learn that the attacks on Arrakis were coordinated by the sisters as a part of their plan to arrange this marriage. As this decade-long plan that Kesha believes may be the path to the reckoning that they fear is coming is just dismissed by Valia as she stands behind her decision for this wedding to proceed. Now, not much later after their conversation with Kesha, we see that Tula speaks to her concerns and convinces her sisters to recheck the breeding process to confirm that they've made the right choice in choosing Nez. Meanwhile, during that conversation, we meet young Lord Pruitt, who meets the Emperor as the pre-wedding rituals commence. Now, in this scene, we see Nez and the red dress from Kesha's nightmare. We also see the fruit being eaten, again remembering this was rotten in the dream, and it stands as a sign leading to what's a bad omen in my opinion, pointing towards death. Now, after the ceremony, we see a Baron Harkonnen trying to convince the Emperor to buy new whale fur to add to his material of his outfits. To me, this just points out the fact that the Harkonnens may have been overlooked during this time period and have come a very long way from when we meet them in the future in the movies, from selling fur to later generations, influenced the Emperor and being one of the most powerful families in the universe. Now, it seems that the young Lord Pruitt isn't all that excited about his newly appointed wife, as he seems a little bit standoffish towards her. Now, Nez senses that something is bothering him and he's being somewhat deceitful as she asks to see what's going on with him, as this leads to him accidentally letting loose his pet tech lizard, which causes a reaction from the crowd because this technology is forbidden. Now, the Empress is beyond upset and looks for the Emperor to take her side and take action, but he doesn't and allows this to be overlooked, which comes to a surprise to the audience and more importantly his wife. Which to me, this just basically illuminates the idea that people do not really trust the decisions that the Emperor makes, but also, again, his wife and him are not on the same page. And we see that Valia reassures her younger sister that the plan is still intact and Nez is indeed the right one to carry on the breeding project against Kesha's nightmare. Now, I personally don't think Valia actually really took her time to reconsider the decision, but she pretended to do so to entertain her sister's concerns. Now, it's also in this moment that we see some of the sisters in training aren't necessarily excited about the arrival of the princess entering the sisterhood without going through the proper training process, which to me is kind of setting up this plot where I can see her arriving and the princess not getting along with some of the sisterhoods, and maybe they're even picking on her, which can lead to Nez and Lila becoming friends. Now, after the commotion with the tech lizard, we see Hart speaking with the Emperor about his concerns about what's outside of the walls and what people are saying about the Emperor, and many question his decisions being made, and they believe that maybe banning the machines was a mistake, but also puts to question why only the great houses profit from the spice. Now, Hart continues by sharing his beliefs with the Emperor, which are beyond man and machine. He claims that there were forces involved that kept him alive during the attacks on Arrakis. He implies that the gods are listening, as the Emperor responds by making a remark that if the gods are real, they'll relieve him of the wedding that is stressing him out, but again, he has to go through it to get the fleet that he was promised. In my eyes, this interaction between these two show that Hart clearly has his own motives, and he's trying to get into the Emperor's ear and trying to make him abandon his faith and loyalty to the sisterhood. We end this episode with the princess and her brother going to celebrate the division at this nightclub before her marriage. It's here that we learn that Kieran is actually an Atreides, and him and the princess engage in more intimate activities this time around before her marriage is official. Now, in the scene, we see the bartender, who has blue eyes like a Fremen, so I'm pretty confident that she is a Fremen. She seemed to be very uncomfortable with the hooking up of the princess and the swordsmaster, so I think that this is definitely shaping up some type of love triangle between the three different characters. I can see if this relationship continues that maybe the princess gets pregnant with his child, and that's going to be looked down upon from the other houses, and the swordmaster might get punished from engaging in these affairs with the princess. Either way, I don't see this relationship ending up well. Our final moments show the Emperor awaking from his sleep to rewatch the footage from the moment that Hart stood as the only survivor, as a sandworm approaches him and he survives the attack. Now, this was cut between Hart finding the young lord in the halls because he couldn't sleep as well. As Hart shares his thoughts about the control repeating itself like the machines had over the humans, and compares this to the control that the sisters have over them, as he shows his powers to the young lord as he begins to panic and his skin starts to burn and he dies. Now, I couldn't tell if Hart was like physically doing this with his mind, or if he poisoned his toy or something that he touched to poison him. Either way, it's clear from the footage and also the scene that he's capable of powers beyond man. As we cut to screams of Kesha, whose skin is also burning at the same time as the young lord's death, which is also a part of her nightmares, as the visions would show people burnt, and it seems that the dream is coming true. As Valia sees this and says that she sees the Mother Superior, and we end with the vastness of space yet again, but this time around we don't see that blue light speaking.
When you find yourself in darkness, seek the light. All that matters is the light. It will lead you back to life, back to us. You will emerge a Reverend Mother.
Was what Tula is telling Lila all a lie? A common tool used by those of the sisterhood, because we've seen what members of their sisterhood would do to protect themselves above all. It's time for a recap and scene-by-scene analysis of Dune Prophecy Episode 2, titled Two Wolves. In this episode, we're shown how multiple characters may be actually wolves hidden in sheep's clothing, whether that's Tula herself, Jin, Kieran, or even Sister Michaela. But we also see the Emperor switching sides and now allowing Hart's undying loyalty to take over. With that said, let's break down this episode, spoilers ahead. Now, before we actually get into the episode, we have our first title sequence of the series. And again, before I get into this, remember this is coming from a non-book reader, so I'm going to try to uncover the meaning behind what's seen in the title sequence. We start at the beginning showing the sisters tapping into their ability to be the truth sayer. From here, we see a knife with blood, assuming that it's the one that Dorsea was used to force to take her own life. We have the shot of the same blood going into the water, again, assuming that this is coming from the first episode of her death. We have here the fruit-shaped item, which is seen in the vision and also used during the pre-marriage ceremony between Nas and Pruitt. We have the shot of Nez in the red outfit from the start of the same ceremony. Now, across different mediums, whether it's books or movies or shows, typically when someone's wearing red, it mostly symbolizes there's danger to come. We have this shot of the Emperor's throne, followed by a shot outside of the palace. Here we have the DNA archive in front of a planet, which to me symbolizes its importance to shaping the world. Now this is followed by seeing dead animals, which I'm not entirely sure about this one. This could be foreshadowing, or were these wolves connected to this episode's title, which after looking up wolves and its importance to Dune, I found what they call D-wolves, which are found in the world of Dune, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Next we have another royal palace, or I believe this is actually the sisterhood place of home and where they train, as you can see them in front. You have this shot of Mother Raquella followed by Valia, or this could be Tula possibly looking over the acolytes. We have this shot, which is later seen in this very episode, of Lila receiving the poison with her partaking in the agony, which is followed by seeing the effects once it hits her system and connecting her to the mothers, as we see later. Now we end this sequence with seeing this planet on fire, which most likely is referring to the Reckoning. Now this is followed by seeing what I assume is a bull, which may or may not have connections to House Atreides, because I go back to Dune 1 when we saw Duke Leto talking to Paul Atreides about how his father would kill bull for sport.
And grandfather fought bulls for sport.
Yes. Look where that got him.
As we have shots of Sam on the planet of Arrakis showing a worm. Now I might be wrong with this one, but I think this is the same instrument we've seen the sisters use, which I believe they call the Garm Jabbar, which is the poison needle. And our final shot shows what looks to be the mouth of a worm into the galaxy, ending in a shot of an eye with fire surrounding it, but it turns into blue, showing the effects of consuming too much spice, and we fade into the title card. So go ahead and rate my accuracy in the comments below if I'm right or if I'm wrong about what I took away from the meaning of this title sequence, but also share your thoughts of what you interpreted those meanings to be in the comments below. Now we open this episode with a shot in space as a ship enters the atmosphere and lands, and we meet a new character. As the sisterhood has called upon a former student by the name of Nazar, who's here to examine Kesha's body and discover the cause of her death. Now before moving on, we see Tula mentions that she came from a Suk, which after looking that up, it's basically a medical school, or also known as a Suk Inner School. It's basically a place where people specialize in medicine and they're devoted to finding the cures for ailments which plague humanity and advancing mankind's medical knowledge. Now we learn that the He Source was eternal, but the initial examination is inconclusive so far, as Tula feels guilty for not listening to Kesha's warning from her nightmares. Again, I mentioned this in my breakdown last week of us seeing this path of Tula going on where she's probably going to no longer take orders from her older sister and ultimately decide to make decisions on her own. As we see in this very episode, she takes another order from her sister, which leads to Lila's potential death. Now after hearing what happened about Pruitt, we see Vanya wants to go to investigate the death, as she starts to connect the two situations to the burning truth that Superior Raquella spoke of. Now Valia plans to protect the princess, but she also wants to protect her plans. Now she doesn't believe that her younger sister Tula is up to task of looking over everything in her absence, but she also mentions that she's always not prepared to making tough choices. Now one of those tough choices comes up in this conversation, as Valia plans to have Lila connected to her ancestors by putting her through the agony. Now this plan is one that Tula isn't a fan of, because she's afraid because Lila isn't properly trained, but also because she raised her. Now, to show her willingness to make tough decisions, we see Tula agrees to do this, which leads to her sister giving her the authority to look over the school. Now, to speak to more of Tula's concerns, she's not only afraid that this ritual can kill Lila, but she knows that if things go as planned, Lila could uncover their secrets that they've kept all these years, which is later shown, and that's Valia killing Reverend Mother Dercea, who we later find out is actually related to Lila. Now, to speak to the process that we see later happens in this episode, which is performing agony, it involves an acolyte of the Bene Gesserit taking a poisonous awareness serum, which is a narcotic, and internally it changes the substance and neuralizes its toxicity, which gains the user the other memory, which combines the ego and the memories of all their female ancestors. Now, if you all remember, we saw this in Dune Part 2, where Lady Jessica took the same poison drug on Arrakis, and it's also called the Water of Life. Now, Valia pulls her favorite acolyte Theodosia aside and wants her to accompany her on her departure. Now, Theodosia mentions something of her circumstances, but it's never really explored in this episode, which makes me wonder what exactly are those circumstances. Could she possibly be wanted from some type of crimes against the Imperium, but the Sisterhood protects her identity for her to become one of them, but she's forbidden to travel to prevent from being caught? Let me know your thoughts on what you all think her circumstances could be in the comments below. From here, we see the aftermath of Pruitt's death, where the Duke is rightfully upset for losing his son, but here is where the Empress attempts to pivot the blame from their family having any involvement of his death, but instead she brings up the boy's toy having some possible consequences because it was a thinking machine. Now, it's important to point out the looks that Constantine and Lady Shannon give each other in this scene, because at first glance, we're just assuming that it's just a sexual tension between two characters, which we see a little bit later, but there is definitely more subtext and more going on between the two that we'll be discussing later in this breakdown. Now, we see Desmond Hart lets the Emperor know that he took his words about the discomfort that the wedding was giving him and his comments of if the gods were listening literally, and he took care of his problems by killing Pruitt, and he would do it again if he was asked to. Now, the Emperor doesn't take keen of this assassination and believes it was just a misunderstanding, but has Hart arrested and taken to the suspensor cells. These are the things I love about the world of Dune, these really cool, interesting sci-fi concepts, as we see that the process of having Hart in the cell has him suspended in air as a form of punishment. I would assume that floating in the air for a long period of time would do something to your body or your mind, but practically speaking, there's a lot of space in these cells, and I would think that it would be a lot less space to be a little bit more effective, but that's just my thoughts. Now, I know that we've seen similar technology being used in the films, especially used to having those hovering around in the air with using their suspensor suits. So to my book readers out there, let me know if this cell is actually a part of the books as well. Now, we watch as Tula tells Lila about Mother Raquela's vision and that she will need to connect to her because she's actually her great-great-granddaughter, and connecting with her will help them find a way to fight the oncoming reckoning. Now, Lila is clearly frightened because, as it was mentioned earlier, she's not prepared for this, but Tula tells her it all boils down to her making this decision to take this risk. Now, to circle back to my comments about Lady Sharon and Constantine, we see them using their talents to get what they want. But again, the importance of this sex scene shows that Shannon is sharing how she barely knew her brother because of their distance that their father put between them. Now, to me, it was like Shannon was creating this sense of comfort with Constantine by sharing with him that, oh, I wasn't that close to my brother, basically establishing that they didn't have that close of a relationship in the first place. As we see them talking about what it means to have real power in this world, and they bring up Arrakis, but reading again the subtext in the scene, both characters are using their looks and using sex as a tool to gather information from one another. You'll notice how Constantine mentioned that he has to prove himself in this moment as he's questioning her about what her father's true intentions are with the fleet, but then he mentions Hart being from Arrakis and he's being put in the cells. Now, of course, this bit of information that Constantine lets slip out, that leads to Shannon questioning if Hart had anything to do with her brother's death. It'll be interesting to see this game between these two characters moving forward. These two characters in my eyes are most likely seeing themselves as being someone that's overlooked by their parents, but they're always seeking their approval. Now, we watch as the Emperor shares the information about Hart's involvement of the killing of Pruitt to his wife, but he also tells her about Hart's survival on Arrakis and being gifted by the Sandworm. Now, going back to what I said in my breakdown last week about the Empress wanting her husband to listen to her more, well, now with Kesha gone, she takes this opportunity to use Hart's loyalty to them as their advantage before considering to execute him. Now, meanwhile, while all that's happening, we have Lila getting some words of encouragement from one of her sisters about sacrifice, and you'll notice that Jen is watching this conversation. Now, in this episode, Jen isn't super important, but there's a lot going on with her kind of observing these type of conversations. I feel like the show is definitely positioning her as one of the sisters that doesn't really share the same beliefs as the rest of the new acolytes. Now, later in this very episode, we see Jen voicing her pushback against the ideals of the sisterhood and the whole mantra of the sisters above everything having its limitations and boundaries, and that they're just using them, and that they're using Lila and they could care less if she dies in the agony process. Again, I believe Jen not fully believing in the sisterhood will be key to the rest of the series, and I wouldn't be surprised if she is maybe revealed to be a spy herself sent to study and gather intel on the sisterhood. What if she's one of the two wolves that are mentioned in the title of this episode? Now, I saw some people making remarks last week that the show kind of looks like a Walmart version of the Dune movies. And look, sure, it's not as clean or pristine from the productional standpoint, but the show is still pretty damn good. Like, it's a pretty good looking show in my opinion, and I use this as an example. I love the scene of Valia traveling to meet the Emperor and seeing the intergalactical travels and the vastness of space. Also, we get to see the beauty of the planet. We have these shots of seeing the day-to-day lives on the people on the land. To me, this show comes across between looking like Dune from the films at certain points, but also it has this kind of cross between the TV show on Apple TV Plus by the name of The Foundation meets Disney Plus Star Wars Andor. Honestly, I hope we get more scenes like this, us on a grounded level, seeing day-to-day life, seeing the vastness of space, and really building out this world, and also showcasing the great productional design, the great sets, because it makes things feel so tangible. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Constantine speaking so candidly to Shannon about Hart leads to the Duke wanting to question Hart himself. Now, the tension in the room is temporarily diffused as Vanya uses her abilities to see that the Emperor is lying about Hart's connections, as the Duke makes threats about ending their deal. Now, Vanya details the Emperor about how Kesha died and how it has connections to Pruitt death, and she gets his approval to talk to Hart. Now, before we get to the interrogation, we see that Nez hears the news from Vanya about what happened to Kesha, as she's reminded about her lessons to calm her nerves. Now, this is where Sister Theodosia is introducing Nez to begin their process of gaining her trust, but Nez doesn't want to have small talk with her. She just wants to know what happened to Kesha. Now, here's where we actually go to the interrogation scene, where in terms of Hart's home planet, which may or may not have some importance for later episodes. She also tries to get into his head and get information from him, but he tells her that he has nothing to hide. Hart doesn't hide any of the truth, including how he took the boy's life as justice under the order of the Emperor. He also admits to killing Kesha because he saw the corruption in her heart and says that she wasn't worthy of serving by the Emperor's side. Now, the Emperor doesn't come to a decision on what to do with Hart because he isn't convinced that he was able to kill Kesha from millions of miles away, and until Valia can prove this, she's sworn to keeping this information to herself. Now, after this interaction, we see Valia using the same shield protection to have this valuable conversation being protected, something that we saw in the first Dune movie between the Baron and that particular Mother Superior, as she wants her sister to gain back control over the Duke by any means necessary in order to keep their plan intact. Now, to speak to the title of this episode, which is Two Wolves, we see one of these possible wolves in action as we see Karen using a scanner, as we'll find out later is to get the full layout of the throne room. Cut to learn that Karen's actually a descendant of a war hero by the name of Vernian Atreides, who is the first person to hold the name and creating them as a great house. Now, this is where we also meet a new character by the name of Horus. We see that Karen is actually a part of a rebellion against the great houses because they're hoarding the spice. Now, Horus plans to strike against the Emperor soon and wants to use the failure surrounding the wedding as the opportunity to do so. I have a question for you all in the comments below. So it was said that Hart saw the corruption in Kesha's heart and she wasn't right for the Emperor. How does that not apply to Karen? Was he not able to see that he was a part of a rebellion? Does he not see Karen as a potential threat, or does he play a bigger role and maybe benefit the throne? Now, to backtrack a bit, I don't want to look over this fact that I didn't anticipate Karen being a spy or, again, a wolf, something I didn't see coming, and I'm very curious to see where his story goes, especially with him being an Atreides. Now, we have this quick scene of Tula telling Lila that her mother died giving birth, which I don't know if it's true or not, but this information seemed to be what it took to get Lila to come to the conclusion to help go through with the agony. Which leads me to believe, is Tula's delicate approach to Lila in telling telling her that there's other options and bringing up her mother just being used as like reverse psychology, and that she's actually has what it takes to get the job done and make those tough decisions that her sister was talking about earlier in the episode? Can Tula be considered to be the wolf based on the title of this episode, or was she being genuine with Lila? Let me know your thoughts about that in the comment section. Now again, going back to the title of this episode, we saw one potential wolf, now we get to see another, as it is revealed as secret meeting with one of her spies, and that spy is the bartender we saw in episode 1, and we also find out that she is a member of the rebellion who was questioning Karen's loyalty, and she's a part of the sisterhood, and she goes by the name of Sister Michaela. As we learn that she actually played a key role in the attacks on Arrakis, which makes sense considering that she's a Fremen. Now, Valia plan to regain the Emperor's trust is giving him the names of the people involved in the raids on Arrakis, and Michaela brings up Karen's name as being the first person to bring up. Now, you'll notice how Vanya seems to take interest in him being an Atreides, again, pointing out the fact that Karen will definitely play a bigger role in the show, and maybe this is the start of where he uses an Atreides to be a part of the breeding process, leading to Paul Atreides 10,000 years later. Now, you can look at this scene in another way, which is Vanya tells Michaela that she doesn't really look at Karen Atreides as a threat, so to me, could this be foreshadowing how future sisters dismiss the Atreides, and I'm specifically talking about Paul Atreides. We see Nez and Karen sparring as she lets out her anger after the recent losses. Now, Nez shares her story about how she was a kid and she almost got kidnapped, and how her father was so passive about the situation. It was in that situation that she learned about what politics meant in this world, and how everyone's basically just this puzzle piece about getting power. Now, Nez doesn't want to physically be involved with Karen any longer, but again, they both have strong feelings for one another, and this will most likely stop both of them, or at least one of them, from fully embracing their paths. For example, I could see Karen compromising his rebellion plans because Nez could get hurt, or if they attack the throne, he might stop it to protect her. Now, we get to see this scene where the Empress pays a visit to Hart and questions if he's an actual prophet. Now, he doesn't know exactly what to call himself, but knows that this gift can be useful. Which, speaking of use, we see Hart suggest to her that he can show their enemies a way to humble them. As we get to see the process of the agony take place, all that matters is light, as it will lead Lila back to life and return as a Reverend Mother. Now, as it begins, we see Tula giving Lila tips, as we see the similar effects of the poisoning as we saw with Lady Jessica in Dune Part 2, but this time around, we get some added context, including seeing Lila entering the other side, where she actually sees all the ancestors and mothers. Man, what a creepy and eerie scene. Like, this is probably my favorite scene in the episode, as Lila awakes and she first hears the whispers of the mothers in the background as they slowly emerge from the shadows and they approach her and they ultimately surround her. At first, they initially all grab at her. It almost seems like they wanted to possess her and take over her body, but eventually she finds Raquella, as she tells her that the key to the reckoning is one born twice, once in blood, once in spice, a revenant full of scars, a weapon born of war, on a path to short. Now, this riddle was a mystery to me. Let me know your interpretation on that. For my book readers, you probably know, but was she speaking to what becomes of Paul Atreides 10,000 years in the future? Will all the planning and preparation to marry the houses actually lead to Paul becoming the emperor, or was it even beyond Paul Atreides? Now, we see Lila is embraced by Raquella, or at least she thinks it's Raquella, as she hears her say little lamb, thinking that it's her mother, but it is not. This individual mentions that her mother being dead was just the way of the sisterhood making her agree to do this ritual, but she actually learns that her mother isn't there, which means that she maybe isn't actually dead in real life. As Lila is shown the vision of what Valia did to Dorsea, who is the one posing right now as Raquella. She's clearly upset about losing her life and being killed, as she essentially possesses Lila and tells Tula that her way of revenge is taking their hope away and taking Lila herself. As we see the mothers completely consuming her mind and she's taken. Now, my question is she like officially dead, or is she in like this comatose state under the control of the mothers? Will we see these scenes of Lila being inside of her head and finding her inner strength to break out of this prison? If this is the case, that she's locked into her her own mind. Now, Dorsea calls Lila her granddaughter, meaning that she's Lila's mother's mom, and it seems like she's still out there possibly. Now, I could be way off, but if this is said to be true that Lila's mother is still alive, maybe Tula finds Lila's mother and has her perform the agony in order to get Lila back. Now, we end this episode with the Emperor speaking to the Duke, who yet again threatens the Emperor by feeding him to the wolves, again the title being brought up, which leads to me looking up the importance of wolves in the world of Dune, which brought me to finding the God Emperor, and I had to stop myself because it was spoiling the future of things that I want to be surprised about. Now, after making these threats, Hart comes in and keeps his promise to send a message to those who pose a threat to the Emperor as he begins the same burning process, and we see him screaming for mercy, which leads the Emperor to having Hart stop. Now, the Emperor tells the Duke to head home and to grieve his loss of his son and forget of any of this happening. This action being what Hart hoped for would happen in gaining the Emperor's trust and sharing what he's capable of. Now, Valia returns to hearing the same whispers that Kesha heard before her death as Hart enters the room. Now, she's prepared to tell the Emperor the truth about the threats within his wall, but Hart tells her that her privileges to the tower have been revoked and she no longer has communication with the Emperor. Hart tells her that he plans to protect the Imperium by wiping out the Sisterhood in its entirety. Now, Valia uses a voice and instructs him to do the same thing that she told Dorsea all those years ago, but this time around we see this person resist and shows that it doesn't work and he was just pretending, as he tells her that he's seen her greatest fear, and that is not being heard, but instead being heard and nobody caring. Her not being in control is her weakness, and clearly she has no idea how to handle or control Hart.
I need you to know that I regret that things are the way they are.
My name isn't Tula Vale.
It's Tula Harkonnen. Griffin will still be dead. And it will still be an Atreides who killed him. We do what we must. You didn't see me.
Tula isn't as pure or as innocent as believed, and showed she's capable of making tough and murderous choices, and she's proven herself as one of the two wolves alluded to from last week's episode 2 title. It's time for a recap and scene-by-scene analysis of Dune Prophecy Episode 3 titled Sisterhood Above All. An episode that showed us just how much vengeance both sisters Valia and Tula carried in their hearts after losing their brother, and Tula's love for Lila leads her to using forbidden technology, which may be the same technology Desmond Hart was reborn with. With that said, let's break down this episode, full spoilers ahead. We open this episode with seeing both Valia and Theodosia leaving the Emperor's palace, as Valia still has the look of disbelief on her face as she looks back, still trying to gather her thoughts after what happened with Hart in the final moments of last episode. As Valia is eager to acting quickly and maintaining the Sisterhood's hold on the great houses after getting barred from having contact with the Emperor. As Valia isn't too worried because, as she says, this isn't the first time she's been removed, and like the others, they will learn. Now, this takes us to our first flashback, which is essentially the main plot of this episode, as we're now on planet Lanklaville, which is the home world of House Harkonnen. As we get these establishing shots of the land where we see the dead remains of the Wells, where the Harkonnens remove their fur for their trade of cell, like we saw back in episode 1. This little character beat here says it all about Vanya's state of mind, as this look on disgust on her face as she says she'll take the usual when gathering the meat just speaks so much to her current situation, how much she's fed up of the current situation. And look, I don't blame her at all, because you have to imagine the smell on that planet has to be horrible with all those dead whales, on top of the fact that this planet is known for having freezing weather all year round. Now, before moving on, it's important to state that whale fur was indeed a large part of the Imperium market, and the planet that they're on was noted for the source of fur, and the chief expert of this fur was desired by many very wealthy people throughout the Imperium, which would explain how the Harkonnens managed to become one of the wealthiest houses over the next few centuries. Now, we see that Valia's selection of whale meat doesn't meet her mom's standards, as it seems that they really don't get along. Here is where we actually meet the sisters' family. We have their mom Sonia, their dad Virgil, and their brother Griffin, who's the middle child, and also has aspirations to get in their family in a better trade deal. But most important of them all, especially what happens later in this episode, we see their uncle, played by Mark Addy, who played one of my favorite characters on one of my favorite shows of all time in Game of Thrones, as the one and only Robert Baratheon.
Look at this idiot. One ball and no brains. He can't even put a man's armor on him properly.
You're too fat for your armor.
Oh, it's funny, is it?
Now it's here that we get the quick backstory of Tula getting her most prized possession from her brother, which was a whale's tooth that he carved himself. Now you'll remember that she gave this to Lila back in episode 2 as a gift before she took the agony. Now their uncle says that Vorian Atreides, who's recently resurfaced around the capital, as Vanya sees this as an opportunity to correct the history books of the Harkonians' name being viewed as cowards during the war against the thinking machines and reclaiming their status. Now for those that might have forgotten, we found out in episode 2 that Kieran is actually a descendant of Vorian, who again was labeled as a war hero and responsible for ending the war in the flashback of episode 1's opening sequence. But also remember that Vorian is said to be the one that really sparked this feud between House Atreides and House Harkonnen by calling them cowards. As Valia mocks her father's position as the mayor of the town because, as she mentions, his great-grandfather was the real hero of the war against the machines and he should have been given all of the praise instead of Vorian, a mistake that Valia clearly hasn't forgotten. Again, it's here we see the early stages of young Valia's leadership and determination at this table scene where she shares her disdain for where her family lives and how the history books have destroyed their legacy, and she won't stand by as it happens. Now Griffin goes to check on his sister, but not before their mom warns him of how Valia is a wolf and that she will devour him. Now their mother using the word wolf is definitely foreshadowing to what's to come, but also harkens back to the last week's episode title of Two Wolves, and Valia being one of those wolves as her intentions can put those close to her in danger. We see Griffin and Valia recall the time where she saved him from drowning with the power of the voice by getting him to swim. Now it seems that Griffin has always looked up to his older sister and shows his appreciation and love for her by backing her decision to find Vorian, and he's on board to finding him to take back his lies and rewriting the history books. But unfortunately, immediately after this moment, we cut to seeing Griffin dead as their uncle speaks highly of him on the family's behalf as they lay him to rest. Now we don't actually see what happened to Griffin, but Vanya says that Vorian is responsible for killing Griffin and has disappeared once again, and Valia wants her vengeance and wants every Atreides to suffer like they have. Now we know that the first big event between the two houses that causes hatred for one another was during the Thinking Machine War, but this particular event just added more to that story. It's the moments like this that I was excited to see this show, as we're getting the Harkonnen perspective versus what we've seen in the movies, which show the Atreides as the heroes. But as they say, there's always two sides of the story. And as an audience member, we can understand why the Harkonnens have such hatred towards the Atreides, and it makes you understand that the show is really about the Harkonnens' backstory and their complex family history. After being looked at for having Griffin killed, we see for punishment, Valia is sent to Wallach 9 to serve in the Sisterhood. Man, I gotta admit, this 10-minute sequence added so much more context to the character of Valia, as it showed how she views the disposition that their family finds themselves in and how she was so determined to get their name back on the map. We also saw, obviously, her hatred towards this planet, but also her spitefulness towards the Atreides, which really makes me wonder what she's gonna do in the present timeline if and when she ever comes across Karen Atreides. Now this brings us back to the current timeline where we find Valia listening to the other sisters, making rumors that if Hart was truly marked by the maker Shia LaHood, and if so, that being the only reason to explain why he wasn't affected by the Superior's mother's powers of using a voice on him. She advises them to return to the houses and counter any rumors attempting to discount their hold on the Emperor, as she sets sights on regaining their hold on him. Now, Michaela gives Valia the news about Lila from her sister and hears the words that were spoken through Lila from Raquella about the key to the reckoning, and Valia immediately cracks the riddle and knows that it was in reference to Hart, as Valia believes that a trip home will help her figure out their next moves. Now, last week, a lot of you all pointed in the comments that you all felt that the riddle was pointing towards Desmond Hart, and it definitely makes sense. The whole twice being born being key, and the idea of him being born man and then dying of a man, but then having being reborn by the spice on Arrakis. Now, I have a theory that I'll be sharing a little bit later in this breakdown, because I don't think Hart was the one that Mother Raquella was speaking of. From here, we cut back to present-day Tula, who's overlooking the comatose body of Lila, as Sister Avela reminds Tula that her actions and grieving for Lila right now is very human of her. Now, the sister tells her that leaving Lila in this limbo of state, one of which that no one has ever returned from, they must let her go. But this is where Tula immediately stops her from touching her and tells her that she'll handle this as she sees fit, and she dismisses her. Here is where Tula drinks the spice tea that was given to her for clarity, as she comes up with an idea to help Lila, one that we'll see later that involves the gifts of the spice. As she picks up the well tooth that Lila dropped, which takes us back to the flashback involving young Tula. Here's where we meet her lover Ori, as they're here to introduce her to his family. Now, it's important to note that Ori is the great-great-great-grandson of Vorian Atreides. Here we see Tula meeting some of the other family members, including this young boy. Now, this actor is Archie Barnes, who you might remember in The Batman in 2022, as he played the kid that was grieving his father's death and may be the future Robin, but you also might remember him as the great, incredible young actor in the latest season of House of the Dragon, who went by the name of Sir Oscar Tully. Now, we find out that this family gathering of the Atreides is all a part of a bull hunt, something I mentioned in my last week breakdown as a sport that the Atreides like to partake in. Now, Tula teaches this young teen to prepare the bait for the bulls, and she briefly explains a toxin found inside the bait, one that can kill a man if consumed. Now, obviously knowing what's going to come later in this episode, if you pay attention to the things that Tula was saying about getting her hands dirty and how she talks about luring the bull in with the bait and putting all these things into perspective for what happens later, all the seeds were planted early on, and it just points to the writing in this episode being so well written. Now, we see that Hori's horse is injured, which causes him some distress, and I think that it might have led him to believe that he might miss out on this very important family tradition, as we see him being forced to put down this horse. But this is where Tula comes up with a more gentle approach to do so by using the toxins she mentioned in the scene before, and this being foreshadowing for later. Now, the point of this moment is so important to the character of Tula, because her showing this horse remorse and kindly putting it down shows her pure innocence and her kindness. But again, I want to remind you all, last week's episode title was Two Wolves, her sister being one of them and now her being the other, because while she's gentle with this horse, she's still ultimately killing it, and more of her killings are going to be happening a little bit later. Now, I can also see the importance of this scene being like a story parallel for what's going on with Lila, as we know that this horse is being put down in this moment, but we also know in the future she's being asked to put down Lila, let her be put to rest and having a better option versus the current state she finds herself in. So I like what they're doing with this scene, the importance of this scene, and also the callback to her using the chemicals to put down the horse now, but we see what she uses those chemicals for a little bit later. Now, going into our second set of flashbacks with Valia, as we cut to Dorothea giving the lessons to the student sisters, where we see Valia speaking to the possible corruption within the Imperium and how she feels about how they should use and wield their influence. Now, in this scene, this is where we see the early stages of the rivalry between Dorothea and Valia and their differences of how they should use their power as truthsayers. We see young Valia speaking to her sisters about her relationship with their sisterhood and how she's not fully bought into their philosophies. Now, the plan was always to become a sister for Valia and serve her brother as a truthsayer, but she obviously lost that passion after her brother's death, but was ultimately forced to go into the sisterhood by her parents, as we know why. Now, we see their vow process and the loyalty of the sisterhood being put to the test, as the sisters must decide if the sisterhood is above all by going inside to continue their lessons as a sister, or they stay outside in the bad weather to meditate on if this is a decision they're fully capable of making. Now, we see Valia as the last person to remain outside, as Dorothea shows her lack of faith in her as being a part of the sisterhood. Now, shortly after, a ship arrives and we see the sisters getting off the ship, and as we see Mother Superior Raquella sees Valia still outside in the rain. Now, as the Superior Mother reaches out to her, we see she uses the voice on her, but this doesn't stop Mother Raquella from inviting her inside, especially after witnessing what she's capable of. Now, in this scene, Raquella tells Valia that she's never experienced the voice before, which makes, according to the show's canon, Valia is the one responsible for creating and the first user of the voice. Again, I'm thinking that this is show canon, so I'm asking this to my book readers out there. Is Valia also known for being the first voice user in the book as well? Now back to the scene, Valia tells Mother Raquella about the first time she used the voice, as Raquella shares with her the foundations of the Sisterhood's mission of helping humanity evolve with the crisis, survival, and advancement, and adversity is the key to this change. Now Raquella gives her some words of encouragement to stay by telling her that she's capable of achieving extraordinary things, and she even goes as far as telling her that she can even shape the core of the Imperium, which we know is what she spoke of on her time back on Lincolnville. This scene just reminded me so much of seeing Tula last week telling Lila how she should go through with the agony and kind of giving her words of encouragement, which just goes to show that the Sisterhood is so good at getting into people's heads, even their own sisters. Now, speaking of Tula, going back to her second flashback, we see that the Atreides are preparing for the hunt as Tula gives the young teen food for the Atreides, not knowing that this would be their last meal as she watches them gather and consume it. Again, remembering that what's inside of this meal is the same toxin she took from that bait. Now we see Tula and Ori sharing a moment of intimacy after he proposes to her after only dating for a few months. Now last week I saw that some people mentioned that they were uncomfortable with the sex scene, and some people saying that the sex scene was unnecessary. And look, to each their own, but for me personally, I prefer when shows have, and movies also have, like these more mature moments, but more importantly, it has the sex scene have a purpose. In my eyes, I felt that last week's sex scene was just showing the levels of manipulation that people will go through, and we see that same tactic being used in this moment as well. To me, Tula sleeping with Ori to disarm any doubts and basically make him think that she will agree to marry him, all while having the plan in motion to end his family's bloodline. Now we cut to the next morning where Tula, who's been going by the last name of Vale, which I think she just literally took the Vale after Lincolnville, her home planet, and she never went into any detail with Ori about her family. She takes this moment to share her true identity with him as a Harkonnen. Now Ori proves that he is an Atreides, showing his nobility as he tells her that she was born into her family's name and born into this family feud without her doing, and he accepts her for who she is, not because of her last name, and he tells her that they're gonna rewrite the history books and rewrite their own future together. But unfortunately, Tula has her own plans to rewrite history, as she shares with him that she can never forget or forgive what his family did to hers by obviously killing Griffin, and it was in this very moment that I knew what she just did, especially when she tells him that he didn't really see her, which is something that he said to her the night before about who she really was. Again, recalling all the scenes that Tula had with the young teen, of her showing him how to cut the animal and her mentioning that the poison in the sack could kill a human, as we see that she put that same poison in the celebration food from the night before, killing all of the men. Now look, I don't want to speak hyperbole and say this is like some red wedding types of shock, because obviously we haven't spent that much time with these characters, but I will give the show its flowers by completely surprising me by having this poor innocent Tula committing these murders. And look, I mentioned it in my breakdown last week and also in my trailer breakdown as well. I knew that we would eventually maybe see this darker side of Tula, and eventually here it is. As Ori sees his family all dead as she poisons him by putting him down with the same needle she used to put down his own horse. Now as Ori dies in her arms, we see the teen boy sees what just happened, and she looks at him and tells him to go as a bull finally arrives after smelling the bait that was set up for the bull, but it was used for Tula's murdering. Now I got a couple questions for you all in the comments below. No right or wrong answers, but after knowing what we know about the Atreides and what they did to her family, was Tula wrong for doing what she did? Now my next big question is, obviously we saw Tula let the teen boy go, which makes me think, who did he grow up to be? Is he Kieran in the future? Is he maybe Horus? And if he finds out who she is, will they be seeking their vengeance? Now if you all take a look at the screen now, this is the credits of this episode, and you'll see that the teen went by the name of Albert, but you notice that the show didn't give him a last name. Now of course we're all assuming that he was an Atreides, but why would the show go out of its way to not show us that he has an Atreides last name? Which makes me think maybe he was a stepson of one of those Atreides members, but also makes me think that maybe he's going to be revealed to be Karen or maybe Horus a little bit later on. Now, personally, I'm leaning towards maybe it being a character that we haven't met yet, because I'm just thinking about the age gap between Karen and Tula seems to be much larger gap than what we see from these flashback sequences. I would imagine that Tula was maybe in her early 20s and maybe the teen Albert was maybe 13 to 15 years old, and if you go go to the present timeline, I think Tula is somewhere in her mid 40s or early 40s, and I think Karen is also in his early 20s. So again, was Albert, who changes his name later in the future, goes by the name of Horace, or is Albert a character that we're going to see later on? Let me know your thoughts in the comments on who Albert can be, and will he pop up later in this season. Gotta mention this one more thing, that after researching the books that this series is based upon, Tula in the books does have a child with Ori, so I wonder if we'll get more flashbacks showing that she was pregnant and we see what happened to that child, which makes me think, could Tula be Karen's birth mother? I want to relate this to the Lila character, who was just created for the show. Lila is not a character, has no ties to the books, and I wonder if they're doing the same thing with Karen, where he doesn't, as far as I can tell, Karen isn't a character from the books. So could Karen actually be like a half Harkonnen, half Atreides, and be the son of Tula? Let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below. Now back to our last flashback of the episode, where we find that Valia and Mother Raquella have grown closer, and Dorothea sees this as well. Now this is where Mother Raquella shows Valia her life's work and showcasing the genetic breeding process, as Valia without question understands this entire process, as she also learns that the technology being used to create this is forbidden, meaning that the superior mother was using thinking machine technology even after it was responsible for taking her own husband's life. Now, after discovering this, we see Valia shares with her sisters that she's going to be next in line as the Mother Superior, but she also shares with them the power of the voice, to their amazement, as Mother Raquella watches from afar. Now, Mother Raquella calls her granddaughter and Valia as the strongest of the sisters and puts them to the test. She sees them both as leaders, and also notices that they've managed to gather their own followings, which weakens the sisterhood. Now, to move forward, she wants them both to become Reverend Mothers by doing the agony, but we see Valia withdraws and walks away. From here, Mother Raquella reads a letter to her from her sister Tula. Now, Mother Raquella can't really decipher the secrets within this letter, but we all know what the letter was referring to, as Viola knows that it's time to head home. Now, Raquella realizes how important Valia's last name means to her, and that she needs to finish unfinished business back at home, but she leaves her with an ultimatum, and that is to leave and not return, or take care of her business back home and come back a Reverend Mother. Now we get our family reunion between the Harkonnens, as the sisters are now back home, as we find out that this was all a part of a plan between the sisters to kill off the Atreides, as this was revenge for killing their brother. Now I could be reading this wrong, but it seems that the plan was to only kill Ori, because again he is the direct great-great-great-grandson of Orion, but Tula took the extra step in killing them all. Take a listen to this audio.
Ori Atreides is dead.
They all are.
I didn't think you could.
Neither did I.
Now again, if it was just planned to kill one Atreides versus all the Atreides, this again speaks to the wolf inside Tula, and she isn't as pure as I initially thought. Now we find out that the rest of the Harkonnen family was fully aware of the murdering that Tula committed and was clearly upset by this, but also afraid of what the ramifications could be if found out. Now we see that Tula stands by her decision, and she says that it was her own decision to make. It wasn't Valia manipulating her, which leads their mother to laying into Valia verbally, saying that she was already responsible for causing them to lose one child, which causes Valia to use the voice on her own mother. Now Valia instructs her mother to pick up the knife, which at this point is a very signature move of hers, but she stops herself from finishing a job, but the message was clear. As we get this shot of Valia, which if you notice, this is actually the same exact shot from episode 1 intro, but we actually see how the scene ends, as this is the moment she goes through with the agony. Now for me, I think Valia ultimately decided to take the agony as a sign of fully letting her family go, besides Tula obviously, but she's also seeking a new family with the sisterhood. Now we don't spend as much time in her mind like we did with Lila, but it's important to understand that Valia managed to make it back because she followed her sister's voice. Now I wanted to point that out because if you all remember, Tula told Lila to follow her voice in episode 2, but we know it didn't work because of Dorothea. It's in this moment that Tula tells her older sister that she's already lost one sibling, she's not going to lose another, as she's going to return to Wellick 9 with her in hopes that their sisterhood will be a fresh start for them both, which Viola responds by promising that it will be and that they now have a new purpose. As we end this episode, we're cutting back to present day, where Tula gathers the sisters to say goodbye to Lila. We see Jen pushing back on the idea that the decision to do the agony from Lila was her being forced to do so by Tula, as Sister Ivola reminds them of the sacrifice that are called upon as sisters as they all say their goodbyes one by one. Now, if I were to have a criticism, it's that I wish that there was more time to flesh out the bond and the sisterhood and the care amongst the sisters to really make their goodbyes have more of an impact for me. Our final scene shows us at the Capitol, which had a Blade Runner vibe, which I was digging, as Valia and Theodosia arrive at the last place that anyone would expect Valia to be. As she says, sacrifices must be made, and the sisterhood above all, as she pays a visit to her nephew that we met back in episode 1, who was trying to sell the fur to the Emperor, as we cut to seeing her uncle who hated her is still alive. Now, immediately I'm thinking to myself, what does he know? What does he have that she can use? Now, obviously, we know how profitable the fur can be for the Harkonnens, or how it used to be for them. It makes me wonder if she's going to maybe have him sabotage the fur and maybe poison the fur and have the nephew sell it to the Emperor. Now back with Tula, who's cleaning up her station as she gets the equipment to put away, as she enters the archives where the breeding genetics are held. Now remember in the flashback earlier where Raquel showed Valia her life's work, she mentioned that she's using forbidden technology to achieve this, as we see Tula is now using the same forbidden technology which is infused with spice, and she hopes that it will reinvigorate Lila's mind with the right dosage to keep Lila alive, as the camera pans out to show the technology beginning this process.
No one can take your power away from you unless you let them. This is the time to be bold.
Definitely a time for bold actions that were taken by these characters, which were on full display in this episode, as the Emperor shows off his new weapon in Desmond Hart, but Tula Harkonnen's own possible weapon has finally awoken, which may even the playing field. It is time to recap and do a scene-by-scene analysis of Dune Prophecy Episode 4 titled Born Twice. An episode that showed us how desperate times call for desperate measures, as the characters draw the line in the sand to take charge into which side of history they want to be a part of, and some characters, for example, like Theodosia, can literally change themselves completely in making this coming conflict more difficult to win for the opposing side. Now you'll want to stick around for the end of this video where I'll be sharing my theory of who or what Desmond Hart really is. With that being said, let's break down this episode, full spoilers ahead. We open with the sounds of a thumper on Arrakis as Sister Emmeline awakes to seeing a person walking past her room. Now you'll notice the color change from the more natural color to this blue hue, which almost matches the blue from the glowing eyes that has a big presence in this episode and definitely has some connections to Lila. Now Em follows this person to the garden area and she sees this person cut their own throat, and as she turns around she sees herself with her eyes shut. To me this can symbolize her and the other sisters closing a blind eye to the truth right in front of them. Now this leads to Jen awaking and she finds the others are suffering from the same nightmare, except for Emmeline is missing from her bed. Now Jen finds her in the same place from the nightmare with a knife in her hand, as we cut to the center of the hole into a worm's mouth, and the same blue glowing eyes we saw in Raquel's vision speaks out to Em, who's about to cut her throat, but Jen stops her from doing so, as it appears that she was sleepwalking without her control or knowledge of how she got there. Which, as I'll discuss a little bit later, this to me is Dorothea trying to speak out to Emmeline. Now back with Valia and her uncle, she looks at the portrait of her brother Griffin on the wall, as we see that there is no love lost between the two characters. Now the rumors about Pruitt's death is a big part of this episode and even mentioned in this conversation, which leads Valia to explaining why she's here. As she finally offers them a truth sayer, which is to elevate their family even after denying them 4 times before over the past decade, but the time has come for that to change. Now her uncle doesn't seem too happy and feels she's abandoned them, as Valia hears whispers saying that she's not welcome and that she should have never come here. As Valia suggests that Harold represent House Harkonnen at the Landsraad. Now, Harold claims that all he wants is better incentives for the welfare trade, but Valia has Theodosia reveal his true desire, which is respect for himself, but also his house. Now, I actually predicted this in my trailer for a breakdown, as we watch as Valia offers to be their truthsayer and assures him a seat at the High Council. Now, sticking with the sisterhood plot for a bit, we see that Tula is hearing similar voices to what her sister did earlier in this episode, as they're saying to her that she's failing to do her part and she can't lie forever. Now, to briefly speak about these voices, who and where are these thoughts coming from? One could say that it's their own voice that they're hearing in their own head, it's their insecurities, their feelings, and their consciousness. Now to me, I feel like this is a side effect after taking and surviving the agony. What if you're left with hearing the thoughts and whispers of your ancestors who are constantly judging and advising you on what path to take to possibly avoid death like the ancestors did? Now Emmeline brings up Dorothea as Tula reminds them of the lie that she took her own life due to grieving of losing her grandmother. Now Tula realizes that Emmeline is using the truth sense on her as they're dismissed, but before leaving, we see Jen tells Tula that the sisters experience the same dream or nightmare, except that Jen didn't have one, which I find to be very interesting. Now let's start to speculate in the comment section about this nightmare that wasn't answered in this particular episode, and talk about why Jen didn't share the dream like the other sisters and why the sisters had the same dream. Now to me, Jen is not as tapped in, pun intended, to the sisterhood and hasn't really fully bought into their beliefs. It's almost like she's posing as young Valia, as we saw in those flashbacks, that she didn't really believe in the sisterhood, and that can maybe explain why she didn't experience the dreams, and it really leads me to believe that Jen will definitely be revealed to be someone that's going to probably stand up against Tula and Valia between the next two episodes. Now to speak to the shared dream that the sisters are experiencing, to me this is definitely a big mystery of this episode, but seeing Emmeline bringing up Dorothea and using the truth sense on Tula, I have this feeling that Dorothea is somehow channeling herself into Emmeline and the others, and again, I think this is because of the connection she made with Lila in the agony. Now back with the Emperor and his family, we see Hart is eating breakfast with them, and Nez doesn't approve of sharing this moment with a rumored child killer. Now in this moment, Nez learns that her time at the sisterhood would no longer be an option. Now in response, Nez knows that Hart killed Pruitt, and he lets her know that he did indeed kill the boy because he broke the highest law in messing with the thinking machine technology, and he was met with the appropriate consequences. As Nez walks away from the table in disbelief from what her father is allowing, which to me is setting her up from distancing herself from her family, as we see throughout this episode. As we watch the various houses that govern the body of the Lance Wrath arrive, the proceedings to addressing the recent events begin. Meanwhile, the Emperor speaks with Hart privately, as he's here to ask him if he started the rumors about Pruitt's death. Now, as we watch Hart destroying Kesha's sisterhood book, we see the Emperor expresses how he thinks of himself as a benefactor of his bloodline as a ruler and nothing more. Now, Hart encourages that the Emperor show those who stand against him with wrath and to use Hart's abilities to put them in check, but as of now, the Emperor declines this offer, showing that there's some sense of nobility within him. From here, we cut to this private meeting between Horace and Karen, who inquire this thermal drone bomb and their efforts to take the power back in hopes that this thinking machine technology will kill the Emperor. Now it's important to note that during this meeting, Horace calls the man supplying them with this weapon Dury, who's actually an Exian. Now in the books of Dune, they are known as a machine-based civilization known for producing advanced technology that skirts the boundaries of anti-computer and thinking machine laws. Now as you would imagine, Dury poses a threat to the Imperium because of who he is and his occupation. Now I want you all to remember that Dury is one of two new concepts or new types of technological beings or species introduced in this episode, and we'll speak of the other one a little bit later. Now back at the nightclub, the plan is set in place with the thermal drones as Michaela questions if Kieran is truly prepared for what's to come if all goes as planned. Now Kieran claims that he's prepared, but the look on his face says otherwise. My guess is he's thinking of one of two things. One is he's thinking about Nez being caught in the crosshairs and maybe losing her life in the explosion aftermath, and the other thought is I bet he's probably thinking of all the major ramifications that can come with resetting the power scales of the Imperium. Now back with Valia, we watch her leave a message to her sister about the news about Lila's death as she proceeds to share more about where she is and what's haunting her from her past. Now she talks about a dream that she's having that resembles the one that Kesha has, but she sees a spider on the wall and she stops and breaks this message and notices that Theodosia is in the room. Now, it could be wrong, but it's almost like Valia never really meant for this message to get to her sister, but these were words and thoughts that she wished that she could say, but she doesn't because she doesn't want to show any emotion or signs of needing help or showing any worry, even with her own sister. Now, Theodosia tells her of the rebellion's plans, as Valia will allow those plans to move forward up until a certain point, as she will be the one to stop them from completing this assassination in order to get back in the good graces of the Emperor. Now this is a high-risk situation because if she fails to destroy this thinking machine technology, everyone in the room, including herself, will die. Valia vows that she won't fail this mission and she will actually reveal Kieran as a traitor and will use the rumor about Pruitt's death to their advantage as she kills the spider on the wall, which to me was a sign of her basically saying that she won't allow anyone or anything to sneak past her. As we watch Valia's plan be set in motion, we see the sisterhood begin to plant the rumors amongst their leaders of the houses and put in place the Harkonnens be in position to take on the risk to accuse the Emperor of having a hand in Pruitt's death and also filling in that vacant spot. This to me is a great example of just how powerful and influential the sisterhood can be. Now we see Harrow is getting worried that he hasn't heard anything back from the High Council about their houses joining, and just seconds later they arrive. Here the other leaders learn just how fast the Harkonnens have come up as Mother Superior introduces herself as serving as House Harkonnen's truthsayer. Now the invite is accepted to join, and this may be the first bit of like jokiness of the show that I can remember that we've seen so far, as we see Harrow whispers good job to his aunt, but he quickly finds out and learns what is required of him as he sees the risk is he's tasked with accusing the Emperor of Pruitt's death, as we see him pulling his aunt aside to discuss this decision. Now, of course, Valia uses her powers with words to motivate Harold in accepting these terms by calling him the future of the family's name. Now, back with the sisterhood, Tula runs an experiment with the help of Spice to see what the sisters' shared dream consisted of. As they make their connection with their mind and body, they begin to draw eyes and a face. Some even draw a body and a tree and a person fallen. Some draw the sand dunes of Arrakis. All these things call back to Mother Raquella's vision of the reckoning. Now, to speak to these drawings, and in particular the one of someone falling, I believe the sisterhood are maybe seeing possible future outcomes, and I bet that person has fallen is maybe Tula or Valia. As we see, Sister Avela tries to stop this, but Tula doesn't allow this to be stopped because she sees this all as a message. Now they notice that Emmeline draws what they believe at the moment to be a well, as the drawings become more uncontrollable and they eventually open their eyes to see the eyes, and again, this goes back to Emmeline's eyes being shut in her dream or nightmare, but now they're literally open, as the eyes from the dream are looking back at them as she says these are the eyes of God judging them, as Emmeline says that the reckoning is officially here. Not to sound like a broken record, but again, Emmeline to say those words just makes me think again that Dorothea has somehow connected to her, because her saying God's watching them and judging them is something we could imagine Dorothea would say based on what we've seen in those flashback sequences. Tula and Avila look over the drawings and realize that they're all different paths, but they're all images that call back to Kesha's dream and Raquella's vision. Now Tula notices that they all stopped at the eyes and that she had no control over awakening them, but it was the fear instead. Now we all know the saying in the world of Dune, fear is the mind killer. As Sister Avila wants to tell the sisters of this discovery, but Tula doesn't want this to cause any more fear. All these lies are just piling up for Tula, and eventually they're going to catch up to her, and this just goes back to those whisperings that she heard about the lies not being something that she can keep quiet about much longer. Now we cut to the Empress, who shares Imperium surveillance files with Hart that show machine dealings that have gone unattended. Now Hart tells her what the Emperor told him about displaying his abilities, but the Empress suggests otherwise, encouraging him to take a bold move. She admits to being the one that spread this rumor about Pruitt's death, and she did this to show the Emperor's power, and encourages Hart to go along with showing just what happens when you disobey the law, and more importantly, disobeying the Emperor, who sometimes needs a little push. As Hart takes this information and has the royal guards find anyone dealing in technology and showing them no prejudice in their actions. Now back at the nightclub, Horace and Kieran indulge in Spice to celebrate as Nez arrives, causing what I believe was fair to Kieran because he doesn't want the princess to know what their plans are. Now Nez shares her inflictions of her father being a good man, but also disappointed in her father's decision to having Hart by his side, especially after killing Kesha, which leads her to offering her help and possibly hurting her father and helping Kieran. Now we get this very interesting line of dialogue from Kieran, who mentions his father surviving an atrocity. Now that can mean anything, but my mind immediately thought to what happened in Tula's flashback in killing the Atreides, which brings me to this next question. Would the teen she let go by the name of Albert be Kieran's father that he spoke of? I personally think it is. Now, even though Nez was against them continuing to be intimate, she kisses him, but Kieran stops her and he doesn't invite her to join the cause and walks away. We already know the plans of the rebellion and how Valia plans to stop it, but now we can add Nez, one of her brothers, to join her in calling out Hart and what he's done. Nez uses what I imagine Kesha taught her on how to use her words to get people to do what she wants, as she believes she's managed to get her brother to help her in doing this in front of their father despite whatever the consequences might be. Now back with Valia playing Theodosia, who notices how important Griffin was to her, which is very important for what happens at the end, but we also hear why her presence on this trip was more than just befriending the princess, but it's because her circumstances involves an unknown talent that she doesn't like using that we finally get to see, and I'll be explaining that more in detail a little bit later. Now, after all the conspiring from all these parties, it's officially time for all the storylines in this episode to come together at the Landsrat, which has now begun. But before the Emperor arrives, we see Constantine wishes his father luck and doesn't plan to attend in helping his sister as she thought, which could lead to Nez no longer believing that she can trust her brother. As we watch Karen prepares his plans, we see Nez is looking for her brother. Meanwhile, Harold is called to speak. As he begins to follow through what was required of him, but he hesitates, which allows Nez the opportunity to continue where he stopped, as she accuses the Imperium House and Desmond Hart of murdering Pruitt, as this unexpected announcement causes Karen to pause his plans. Now, Hart takes this opportunity to speak of order as he brings out the people he collected in ties with the Thinking Machine dealings from the surveillance footage, including Deary and Horus. As we watch, Hart shares his experience on Arrakis with the different predators that are on that planet, as this line of dialogue from Hart is almost speaking to his existence, as he says,
It is terrifying to experience, but when it comes, soldiers rejoice, because they know for a day the beasts of prey wreaking havoc upon them will scatter across the desert, scared of the devil too.
Now, Desmond Hart admits to his crime, but he doesn't call it a murder. Instead, it was an execution for using Thinking Machine technology, as he reveals the rebellion's thinking machine and sets forth another execution. As he says, no more excuses, no more exceptions as far as the use of Thinking Machine technology, as he awaits the orders from the Emperor to execute these traitors, as the Emperor gives him the go. As Hart burns the rebellions, but also Lord Hagal, who we saw had direct ties with the rebellion, as each of them brutally burned alive in front of everybody in the audience. Now, in the midst of all this chaos, we cut into Hart's eyes, again putting an emphasis on the importance of eyes in this episode. As we're taken to Arrakis, where we see from Hart's perspective from what we saw that surveillance footage in episode 1, where Shai Hulud consumed him, and we see those glowing eyes appear, which to me seamlessly confirms the connection between Hart and the set of glowing blue eyes. Again, born twice, one of blood, one of spice, which, speaking of blood, we actually see the blood appear on Hart's back, showing the aftermath after what he did of using the power, as well as blood that he left on his hands in front of Valia. Now, I haven't quite made the full connection between Shai Hulud and Hart, but I feel like his hate towards the Thinking Machine comes off very scripted. What I mean by that is, I feel like this new reborn version of himself feels almost programmed to hate Thinking Machines, but he seems to be very robotic himself. So I'm possibly thinking that this reborn version of him is the same technology he hates without knowing that it's inside of him. Again, my theory that I mentioned in my last week's breakdown is that Vorian Atreides is still alive and he's Hart's creator. Now, to backtrack in the scene, Hart leaving the blood behind is the weakness that Valia spoke of earlier to use against him, which leads right into seeing Harold's disappointment of the events, but we see Valia did indeed collect Hart's blood and will examine it with the breeding index to determine who Hart is and where he comes from, a very smart move. Now we cut to the Emperor checking on his weapon and sees the aftermath of what using his abilities leave. We see the Emperor sympathizing with Hart and places his hand on his shoulder for comfort and wants him to stay. It was almost like this was framing the Emperor seeing him as his son, the son that he always wanted by his side, unlike Constantine. Now back with the sisterhood, we see some of them meeting in secret, led by Emmeline, who spreads the beliefs of Mother Dorothea to those who will listen. Now during this, we see Jin overlooking the drawings. Now it could be wrong, but this seems to be setting up history repeating itself. For example, we have Emmeline, who has her own believers now. We also have this resurrection of a character who we'll talk about here in a second, and we also have Jin, who, if you look at all three of them, they're probably going to be posing opposite of each other, which in my mind is setting up the division that Mother Raquel feared back with Dorothea and Valia. Now we watch as Tula goes to speak to Lila and believes the prophecy of the one born twice is her, and she needs her to awake to stop the oncoming reckoning. Now in comes Emmeline that speaks of all the lies of Tula, and I mean all of them. She mentions the murder of Dorothea, the murder of Ori and the Atreides, and her sins have finally caught up to her. We see the walls begin to rise with sand, and Emmeline vows to speak the truth of all the lies to the Imperium. As Em walks away, we see Tula comes up behind her and slits her throat, just as the nightmare had of a throat being cut, but this to me is definitely foreshadowing and maybe Tula's demise. But we end up seeing that this was actually a nightmare that Tula was having, and she awakes to find that Lila has literally broken out of her chamber. Now Tula finds Lila walking, and you'll notice the new set of, you guessed it, her blue eyes, which to me basically resembles the same set of blue glowing eyes from the nightmares and the visions, and points towards her having some connections to being a part of either being the actual reckoning that they all fear, or at the very least being the one that stopped it, as Lila and Tula hug, but Lila is unaware of where she is. Now again, is this seamlessly fully reborn version of Lila, once born of blood, now of spice? Will she have new abilities that are similar to Heart, or is Dorothea puppeteering her and she's posing as Lila and will seek out revenge from the Harkonnens? What's even more important to remember is the fact that she's experienced the agony and knows what Tula and her sister did to Lila's grandmother Dorothea, so will she confront Tula with anger and frustration and want to harm her after knowing the truth about Dorothea's death? Will this once mother and daughter relationship no longer exist? Which in return could be the gateway or result in setting a path to a new sisterhood led by who's ever remaining after Lila's possible reckoning against the Harkonnens. Now we end this episode with Valia confronting her uncle, who calls her a murderer, and she's always leaves the rest of the family leaving to cleaning up her mess. He continues to push on by mentioning her being responsible for her brother's death and calls her a black hole, which may be a metaphor for the black hole that we've seen in the visions and the nightmares, and Valia being the cause of all the death. We watch as she keeps hold of his medication that he's in need of in this moment, but it doesn't stop him from calling her names and her being responsible for breaking those close to her. He reaches out for his medication, but he falls to the ground and reaches out as Valia tells him if she would have listened to him, House Harkonnen would have been on top, as we watch him slowly die. Now we hear the whispers return as she looks at Griffin's portrait, but here we see Griffin returns in the flesh as she hugs him, as this being the only time we've seen her show any emotion. Watch as he basically repeats the same lines he told her before he died when they were young, and all of a sudden we see his skin begins to turn red and falls off. As we learn that this was Theodosia's special gift that she didn't want to use, as she can temporarily shapeshift, and this was needed for Valia to hear this from her brother in order to get the encouragement she needed from the one person that she truly loved. Now as we can see, this process seems to be extremely painful for Theodosia as she transitions back to herself. Now what we just witnessed comes from the source material of Dune and is referred to, as we know, as Theodosia's gift. They call it a face dancer, also known as a shape changer. Now, they're a sterile race of metamorphic transhumans engineered by the Bene Therax. Now, the Bene Therax were a group of secretive, genetically altered humans who inhabited Therax. Now, their skills are known to be genetically engineered, however, made them effectively a necessary evil. Now, to me, it seems like this process seems like a tool that I could see Valia forcing Theo to use again to take form of maybe Hart or the Emperor himself. Now this brings me to my theory. After doing some more research on this species, it appears that they have these tanks that allow them to act almost like clones, and they can inhabit their subjects or shells' memories and have a very distinct appearance to their eyes. Now the subject that they're taking form of must be dead, so taking that all into account and remembering how I mentioned in this episode introducing new species, I believe this explains who Hart is, and him being reborn is connected to Theodosia's species. Again, I went down this rabbit hole, and this could explain the return of one of my favorite characters from Dune Part 1, and that's Duncan Idaho, but again, that's another conversation for another day. But those watching or listening, what do you all think about my theory that it's Hart that has been transformed into the species and he's actually acting as a clone?
What kind of abomination is this?
I found a way to save her. Sister Lila is still in recovery.
And does Valia know about this?
I am doing as I was tasked to do, to protect the sisterhood at all costs. Is that not your aim?
Of course it is, but
Good. Then we are in agreement.
We have seen the things that Tula does for the one she loves, but after this episode and after what she discovers at the end, the question I have is, will she continue to put the sisterhood above everything, or will she want to do the right thing by her son that she abandoned? It's time to recap and do a scene-by-scene analysis of Dune Prophecy Episode 5 titled In Blood Truth. An episode that really showed that in blood comes the ultimate truth, and a truth that can lead to ultimate power or death. Now, you'll want to stick around towards the end of this video where I'll be sharing my theory about the connections between Desmond Hart and Albert Atreides. With that said, let's break down this episode, full spoilers ahead. We open this episode in space where we see these ships entering the atmosphere as we see Sister Francesca arrives. Now, I broke down this character and who she is in my episode 5 trailer breakdown, so you can check out that video, but I thought the episode did a good enough job of really letting us know who she is, her connection to the Emperor, who her son is, but after this episode, I am very curious to know how she will be playing a big factor, if at all, in the finale next week. Now, we watch as Hart gets rid of his old clothes and switches into his new outfit for his new position. Now, taking a brief moment to look at this piece of cloth that Hart seems to have a very close connection to, I don't remember seeing him having like many scenes with this item, but it's safe to assume that it might come from his mother, who we'll be discussing a little bit later. After the failed attempt on the Emperor's life, we see he has a new input in how he wants to rule the Imperium by defending values with ferocity and pride. Now, we see the Emperor has a new elite regiment, and he assigns Hart as his new Bajar to lead these soldiers and to eradicate treason and serve the house with honor and loyalty. After this announcement, we see Hart already making suggestions to showing the power of the Emperor, which, speaking of power, we see the effects that this particular character has over the Emperor, and I'm speaking of Francesca, who makes her presence felt by making a very standout dramatic entrance as she is here to see her son Constantine. Now, in this moment, you'll notice how the Emperor was immediately enamored by her presence, but also you notice how uncomfortable the Empress was, and you can see that there's definitely a history between these three characters. Now, if I'm being honest, this makes me think about the complicated relationship between Duke Leto Atreides and Lady Jessica, and how they weren't able to marry one another because of who they were. Now, to me, it was always apparent how much Leto was in love with Jessica, and I always felt like Jessica eventually fell for Leto, but was initially meant to only be with him on behalf of the sisterhood, all a part of their breeding system for power, so I couldn't help but to make the connections with the relationship between Francesca and the Emperor. Now, cut to Constantine apologizing to Nez for leaving her alone, and he speaks on how it was so difficult for him to be there for her because of how their father thought that he was there to support him, but he promises to not leave her again, to support her moving forward, which is ultimately which led to his decision involving Karen a little bit later. Now, back with the sisterhood, the acolytes are basically being told to just move on from their shared nightmare, but Jin refuses this as Tula walks in and puts her in her place, which is really just a front because she removes her from the classroom to show her something. Now, Tula realizes that Jin not having the nightmare may help her as she takes her to see Lila, who's battling with one of the foremothers who's trying to take control of the host by taking over her body. Now, Tula needs Jin's help to guide Lila back to her normal self, but she also knows that it's going to take time for Lila to learn to settle with her ancestors, as Jin is left to watch over Lila while Tula attends other matters that need her attention. Now, 5 episodes in, I'm still not entirely sure just how important Jin will be to the overall story. Now, obviously, she's been positioned as like a character who's very rebellious, and she's obviously close friends with Lila, but her not experiencing the nightmare and how prominent she's been used in the last few episodes, it just makes me think, what will be the character's endgame? Is she secretly going to be revealed to be a spy? Will she play a very big part into how the story wraps up in the finale? Again, how important is Jin? Let me know what you all are thinking about her so far in the comments below. Now, back with the royal family, we see Francesca looking over the painting of the wedding between the Empress and the Emperor as we get this scene between mother and son. Now, in this moment, we find out that Constantine wasn't the one that requested his mom, like Francesca had said, but in this moment, we also find out that she learns about Kasha's death, news that she wasn't aware of. Meanwhile, Harrow plays his role in this battle between the sisterhood and Hart as he pays the visit to the new Bashar to apologize. Now, Harrow tells him that his actions were due to the misguidedness of his aunt, as Hart takes the bait and wants to know the connections between the sisterhood and rebellion, and in return, Harrow will get a reward as they share a bump of spice together. Now, this leads Harrow bringing up some whale hijacking run by some smugglers, as Harrow believes that is in connection with the rebels through this underground market. Now, for this information, Harrow is gifted a small piece of thinking technology as Hart takes Harrow's underground lead, which ultimately we see is set as a distraction for Francesca to have a clear path forward towards the Emperor, and hopefully this will lead to Hart being eliminated. Now I have a question for you all in the comments below, and correct me if I'm wrong, but after I want to say episode 2, we were led to believe that Kasha was killed by Hart because of her bad intentions in her heart, and she wasn't right to serve at the hand of the Emperor, and that was the reason why he killed her. So I was under this impression that Hart had the ability or similar abilities to truth sensing, and he can see through people's lies. But in this scene, as well as not being able to see through Karen a little bit later, he doesn't have that ability. So was I the only one that was thinking that he had some type of way of seeing through people's lives? Were you all thinking the same thing? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now we cut to Francesca, who's confronting Valia about not telling her what happened with Kasha. Now you'll notice a connection in the level of trust that Francesca has in Valia as she reaches out to her to hold her hand as she tells her the next step in her plans. Now this relationship isn't as one-sided as I initially thought, and Francesca isn't completely powerless to Valia. As she wants insurances for her son, we see Valia believes that she can get her son put in this position to being the new leader and the new commander over his father's new fleet. Now back on Salusa, we get this quick shot of Karen in his locker with his belongings, and you'll notice his mishandling of the valuable information he holds linking him to the rebellion, which comes back around towards the end. Now Hart invites Karen to join him on the hunt of insurgents, which I have to admit, I gotta say this now, was it me or was Hart having just too much fun with all this new power he's been appointed? We get all these smirks and these little remarks that he has throughout the episode. Now Karen doesn't tag along because of a training session he has planned with the prince. Now this lesson is cut short because Karen blames Constantine for running late and his lack of discipline, but Karen really heads off to warn Michaela of Hart's hunt, but this level of aggression towards Constantine will ultimately come back to bite Karen in the end. Now this isn't anything huge, but as a fan of the Dune movies, I thought this was a little cool moment here as we see Constantine does the sword gesture that we've seen in the Dune films from Paul and we saw from Duncan when they're holding the sword to their head before battle. Now at the nightclub, we see Karen tries to convince Michaela to leave before her cover is blown. Now, Michaela can see that Karen still has 1 foot in and 1 foot out because he still has feelings for Nez, but she also shows him just how prepared she is with her bag of explosives that she'll be using if and when Hart pays her a visit. Now, back on Wellick 9, we see some of the sisters are actually leaving the sisterhood because I believe this is all in connection with their fear of having the recent shared nightmare of the coming reckoning, but at the same time, we also see Valia provides Hart's blood sample to the sisterhood that she obviously collected at the end of last week's episode. Now back with Jen and Lila, we see Lila is briefly present in this conversation, but is quickly overtaken and begins talking about the reckoning as Jen realizes that she's no longer talking to Lila, but instead she's talking to the very first Reverend Mother and Raquella. Now, before we move along, I just want to give it up to the actress who plays Lila. If you all do not know, this is her first major acting gig, and obviously for like 2 episodes, she was basically asleep on the bed and on that table, but before that, she gave an incredible performance in the agony scene, but I just thought that she was great in mimicking and almost sounding like exactly like Mother Raquella in these scenes here, as well as the scenes that follows this. I think she's a really great actress and has a really promising career ahead of her. Now, Jen takes Mother Raquella / Lila to see Tula, who is really united with Mother Raquella, and this is honestly a relationship that we haven't seen on screen between Mother Raquella and Tula, but you can clearly see that Tula respects her by just how quickly she took orders from her, as they know that they don't have much time left as they get to work. Now, Mother Raquella is happy to see that the sister school is still standing, as Tula gives all the praise to her sister's work of expanding the sisterhood. Now, help me out in the comments below. We see these two characters kind of playing catch up here in this moment, and Mother Raquella brings up her granddaughter Dorothea and learns that her and Valia didn't resolve their differences. So my question for my book readers of Dune and those that know the lore very well, are the foremothers not aware of the others surrounding them in that realm and in that place that they are when you take the agony? Are they not able to communicate with one another in this afterlife? Because wouldn't Raquella know what happened to her granddaughter Dorothea? Now in this moment, it was basically implied that Raquella understood that the differences between Valia and Dorothea led to Dorothea's demise, but I could be mistaken. But again, I'm just confused. I just was under the assumption that the ancestors ancestors were very aware of the other ancestors that were around them in the afterlife, but apparently that's not the case. Now back to the scene, we see that they begin examining Kasha's brain tissue, and Raquel recognizes it from her time in the war. Now, as they study this sample, Raquel speaks of this plague and how the machines designed a pathogen that affected the human body and that it released enzymes to affect the liver. Now, during all this, Sister Avela interrupts this session and she sees that Layla has been resurrected, and clearly she's shocked in this scene, and there's no time for no major ethical or moral discussions to be had because sisterhood above all. As Raquel discovers that this is a virus and that the nightmares and the deaths are all connected to this airborne RNA retrovirus. Now, a couple things I want to mention about this scene. Number one, I just have a feeling that after basically being told to shut her mouth and just to keep things moving, I think Avela will do something very drastic come next week in the finale, because I think she's had just about enough of Tula and she is just done with her at this point. But more importantly is what we learned in this scene. Now, speaking to the virus, we now know that it was once used by the thinking machines to take out the humans, so I'm in two thoughts of this discovery. Now, one of my thoughts is that I've been talking about this for the last few weeks, is how I feel like Vorian Atreides is still alive, and like I mentioned in my breakdown a couple weeks ago, very similar to what his character does in the books, he's infused with the thinking technology, and I believe he just wants to get rid of all of the Harkonnens. Now, my other thought is that this is all a part of a plan being orchestrated by an Atreides, and that Atreides goes by the name of Albert, and I'll be talking about that a little bit more towards the end. And last but not least, they showed in this episode, and particularly in this moment, that Lila hasn't controlled the ancestors taking over her mind and body, which makes me think that the door is still open for Dorothea to take over, and I can see like Emmeline and some of the other sisters following Dorothea's orders in the finale. Now again, we get the confirmation with this scene here, as Hero was indeed working under Valia's guidance, and if he succeeds with his plan, Valia promises that House Harkonnen will be in good standing and good graces with the Emperor. As we watch Valia giving Harrow the family ring that their uncle once wore, as we see him heading off to bury their uncle on their home planet. Now, Theodosia doesn't fully understand the plan that's at play with Valia, but she assures her that the emotional and the physical bond between the Emperor and Francesca is a bond that will never be broken. Which, speaking of, we see the Emperor and Francesca speaking about their son, and how the Emperor and his son share a similar viewpoint on the responsibilities they were given when they were around the similar age. Now, Francesca takes this opportunity to set forth her plan involving their son and securing the sisterhood's hold on the Imperium, as she positions their son to have more control and power, as we see the Emperor take this opportunity to kiss his old love, but we see that she's here on business, not pleasure, at least for now, or until this deal is done, as she stops him from going any further and walks away. To me, this scene just really highlights the power that both the sisterhood have in the grand scheme of everything, but also just how much power Francesca has over the Emperor. Again, a bond that is definitely one-sided. Now, back with Michaela and Kieran, they continue to plant the explosives as they hear that Hart is arrived upstairs. Now, after questioning and most likely killing an insurgent, but before doing so, Hart was told that Michaela's place of business is a hotbed for insurgent activity. Now, Michaela denies these claims, but that doesn't stop Hart from proceeding with his raid of the nightclub. Now, Hart brings up a very interesting question about Michaela and her profiting off of her home planet of Arrakis and working with her oppressors. This is something that I've been questioning myself because of her being a Fremen and being also a part of the sisterhood. I wonder if she was told by Valia that Arrakis would ultimately benefit from their work, but of course this was a lie because Valia just wants the betterment of the sisterhood. Now, as the raid is happening, we see Kieran kills 3 of the men and together they fight off the rest. Now, during this, the timers are ultimately set off, but before they do, Hart discovers that Michaela is a part of the sisterhood by finding her outfit. Now, just as the explosives go off, we see Hart quickly activates his shield, preventing his death. Now, outside, we see Kieran recognizing that she used to kill one of the elite soldiers as a knife that the sisterhood used, as we see that she confirms that she is indeed working a part of the sisterhood. As he confronts her about this, he ultimately lets her leave, but before doing so, he mentions her disloyalty to the rebellions, but ultimately her own people on Arrakis. Now, to backtrack a bit, I want to talk about Kieran and how I mentioned how I think it was pretty much confirmed that his father was Albert in last week's episode. I bet you that Kieran was taught as he was being raised to hate the sisterhood, right? And if his father ever did find out that Tula was a Harkonnen, I bet you that he really instilled to not only hate the sisterhood, but more importantly, hate the Harkonnens. Now, this wasn't a very long scene, but it's still one of importance to this overall story, as Jin yet again asks Tula if Lila is being used as a tool for the sisterhood to use, as Jin asks Tula if she knows of what sacrifice is about, as Tula tells her that she knows more than she could imagine. To me, this has a lot of meanings. Number one, this is obviously referring to her and Ori and having to kill Ori and the Atreides. But now, after what we find out later, she also lost a son that she had to give up. A decision that will come back to haunt her and the sisterhood as we briefly cut back to seeing Hart survive the explosion. As we cut to seeing Constantine, who's letting out some anger and he's drinking while doing so, as we see this discussion with him and his mother about not knowing anything about her side of the family, and she says that her family is basically the sisterhood, which sparks him to ask the next question, which is, what is the purpose of him being born? Now, to me, it's clear that Francesca was in a position to have a baby with the Emperor as a power move to be a part of the breeding system, but it doesn't remove her having like actual feelings about the Emperor, but more importantly, having feelings about her son. Now, like any good sister, a part of the sisterhood, she answers his question with a purpose behind it, as she tells him that he was born to ultimately protect his sister, the future leader of the Imperium, from anyone who brings harm to her, to any people who claims to love her. A message that's very important to what's going to happen in the very next moment. I can't stress enough just how intelligent Valia and just how the sisterhood really operates. Just thinking about the fact that Valia had her close best friend and Francesca have a child by the Emperor. That way they always have their hand on the steering wheel, at least one hand on the steering wheel. Meanwhile, he had a child, obviously Nez, who is a child of a mother who's not a part of the sisterhood, but they still managed to get their hands on Nez and her wanting to be a part of the sisterhood to learn their ways and trying to take the lead in being the next leader of the Imperium. Now, back with Constantine, he finds Kieran's hidden secret that I spoke of a little bit about earlier that Kieran just kind of mistakenly handled, as it's from his observations with the throne room as Constantine awaits to confront him about this. Now, as he arrives, we see that Constantine has told the others that he was a part of the rebellion as we watch Kieran be taken away. Now, this action ends up getting rewarded as the Emperor in front of the other leaders tells them that Constantine was a part of the apprehension of the traitor Kieran, who they're going to make an example out of. Now, it doesn't stop there, as the Emperor also announces Constantine as the new leader of his fleet. As this comes as a surprise to both Nez and the Empress, which is so interesting considering the Empress immediately goes to after this announcement, and we see where Nez goes as well. Now, speaking of being upset about bad news, we see Michaela isn't happy about how Valia is handling all the years she invested, and now it's been completely destroyed, as she basically tells her that she just risked her life of taking out Hart was basically a backup plan for the backup plan. Now, she's given access to a safe house on Arrakis, but her loyalty to the sisterhood is now kind of on the fence, as she vows to never betray her people like she did to the rebellion. As we see, Michaela leaves a message to Theo as she tells her,
See how long you remain this naive acolyte.
So it's going to be interesting to see if Michaela has much loyalty with the sisterhood, but also what she says to Theodosia. I am very curious to see if we're going to see Theodosia use her shape-shifting abilities in next week's finale. Now, we end this penultimate episode with Nez paying a visit to Kieran, but before she speaks to him, she taps into her truth sense. Now, Kieran admits that he cares for Nez, and that was really the main reason why he didn't go through with his plans of the rebellion, and he also tells her that he can bring forth a better Imperium, and she sees that everything he spoke of was very truthful. Which to me makes it a safe assumption that she will break him out, and I won't be surprised if we see like this team up between Kieran, Nez, and maybe even Michaela. Now we see that Lila as of right now is back to her normal self, or it could be Dorothea, we'll see in next week's finale, but she's talking to Jin, who reminds her just how brave she was throughout this entire situation. Now our final moments show Tula going into the archives and examining Hart's DNA. We cut between this moment and seeing Hart back, and he's met with the Empress, who believes that he's a chosen one, as she was chosen as well, but she also mentions that they share something in common, and that's their hatred towards the sisterhood and also having things being taken away from them. Now, while she's saying that she's had things taken away from her, and particularly her husband's love and power, we see Francesca shows her appreciation to the Emperor by awarding their son and making sure that their bond is still intact. Alright, this is the big moment here. Back with Tula, we learn Hart's bloodline has him as an Atreides, but also a Harkonnen, as she sees a picture of a baby and immediately recognizes that it's her son, something that I said back in episode 3. As Hart tells the Empress about how his mother gave him away to live amongst the scavengers and how he was forced to survive, and that his mother was a sister, but it seems as though he doesn't know the identity of who his mother is, who we find out is Tula. As we see, the Empress takes this opportunity, very similar to Francesca. She kisses Hart and she wants them both to get rid of the sisterhood that has taken so much away from them together forever.
I'm not afraid anymore, Tula. The reckoning is still upon us, stalking us from the darkness. If the shadows are where they want to fight, then that is where I shall go.
We see if Valia is the monster her choices made her out to be, as we watch a different self-created reckoning that separates the sisterhood in this episode, and we also say goodbye to some important characters, all while being left in the dark to an unknown enemy who's been scheming against the sisterhood from the shadows, the same shadows that Valia thought she belonged to.
Oh, you think darkness is your ally?
It is time to recap and provide a scene-by-scene deep analysis into Dune Prophecy's Season 1 finale of Episode 6, titled The High-Handed Enemy. An episode that gave us a new meaning to sisterhood above all and answered some major questions set up throughout the season, but also sets up a recently announced Season 2. You're going to want to make sure to stick around to the end of this video, where I'll be sharing a theory about who's the mystery person that's responsible for creating Desmond Hart as a weapon. With that said, let's break down this almost feature-length sides episode, spoilers ahead. After discovering that Hart is her son, we open this finale with Tula hearing the foremothers criticizing her for abandoning her son, and they also tell her how she should never have listened to her sister. You know, it's interesting to think that the foremothers are talking to the Reverend Mothers, and I am very curious to know, since Tula and Valia are sisters, like which foremothers are speaking to which characters. Are they hearing the same thing from the same foremothers, or are some foremothers pushing against them to work against each other? I am just so fascinated by that whole concept. As we flash back to the night of Mother Superior Raquela's death, and we see a different perspective of the confrontation between Valia and Dorothea, as Tula, Francesca, and Kasha watch from afar. Now, as we know, Valia uses the voice on Dorothea, and Tula watches, and to me, she remembers the last time she saw her sister use the voice on their own mother. But unlike that last time where Valia stopped herself, we of course know what she did this time around as she proceeds to instruct Dorothea to take her own life. Now, we get the continuation of this scene from the premiere episode, where we see them asking in panic what they should do next, as Valia responds with sisterhood above all, which after what we discover later in this episode, that now has a whole new meaning. We see Tula suggest that they walk away, but Francesca reminds them that they'll eventually get caught, as Kesha says that they should reveal the truth, which leads Valia to making up the story about Dorothea taking her own life because of her grandmother's recent passing, as they slowly begin to agree by adding to the story, except for Tula, who runs away. Now, Valia finds her sister throwing up and tells her that she had no choice because Dorothea threatened to destroy everything that Raquela had built, and essentially framing that as a tie to this new life that they have built with the sisterhood. So Valia made the choice to act, and she said her hand was forced. As Tula responds by revealing her pregnancy, which explains why she was throwing up. Now, Valia asks if it's Ori Atreides' child and begins to think that maybe he forced himself on her sister, but Tula lets her know that it wasn't like that, as Valia asks if she wants to keep the kid, and Tula tells her yes. Now, despite her hate towards the Atreides, we see Valia says that she'll support her sister and they should raise the child together, even with the sisterhood's policy against having separation between mother and child. Now, we watch as Valia looks her sister dead in the eye, and she tells her,
I told you, if you followed me here, I would protect you. This is our family now. Our, sisters above all.
Now, you'll notice Valia says to her sister, sisters above all. You notice a difference. There's no sisterhood this time around. Such an interesting moment for these two characters to me. Now, to me, Valia is half being truthful in this moment and wanting to support her sister Tula. Now, part of me feels like Valia said this in regards to supporting her sister because she doesn't want her sister to possibly let it out what happened to Dorothea, so she wants to prevent any confrontation between them. Now, another part of me says that she said all this in support of raising this child with her sister is to buy herself some time to see if the child child could have any interest to her and of course the sisterhood, and probably use the child as a tool later, which comes to light a little bit later in this episode. Now we cut to present day where Sister Nazir has returned and Tula shows her the students' drawings of their shared nightmares. Now Nazir tries to understand the situation of how Kasha was able to survive days after being exposed to the virus versus the almost instant death from those at the Landsrat. Now Tula mentions the exceptional mastery of Kasha with the Prana Bindu, which in the world of Dune is a demonstration of superior control over one's nerves and muscles. Now the topic of fear is brought up in this conversation, which happens to be a key part of this episode, as we learn that Kasha at a very young age had the ability to live in the face of fear. Remember that for later. Now this conversation sparks Nazir suggesting that the virus feeds off of fear. Now she suggests that this is being used as a bioweapon, but the question remains, what is its connection to Desmond Hart, as she believes that Hart was not only a vessel for the virus, but it was also its first victim. Now this section of the episode definitely reaffirms the idea of this series building to the concept behind one of the famous things of Dune is fear is the mind killer, and the events of Desmond Hart being the origins of that concept. Now we'll be discussing something else that's synonymous to that a little bit later in this breakdown. Now, as we know, as Hart's mother, we see Tula suggest that they help him and use him to create a cure, similar to what Mother Rakela did in creating the raw sac poison. Now, since they've been exposed, they can transmute the virus as Tula volunteers, but Nazir wants to do it instead because of her qualifications as a medical examiner. She's also been exposed to the nightmare as well. We watch as they perform the transmutation and bond Nazir with the foreign agents. As it begins, Nazir notices something is wrong as the virus is reacting quickly to making the bond. Now we see the violent reaction beginning to happen, but Tula reminds her of her training as a sister, and for a moment she's in control, but immediately she's overtaken by its potency. As she begins to scream in agony, and she says that she sees the monster on Arrakis, followed by her seeing eyes, and that these same eyes are watching him. They're watching. Now, as she tries to fight this virus off, she says that it's not human, as the more she fights, the stronger the effects become, as we see her yelling out, and unfortunately she dies, as Tula watches and cries because yet another sister has been taken by this virus. This time around, it wasn't because of Hart directly. Now we cut to Hart as he's torturing Kieran for answers about the Sisterhood's involvement in the insurgents. Now Kieran assures to Hart that he had no idea about the Sisterhood's involvement, as he reconfirms the theory that Albert was or is his father. Again, the way he speaks about his father is always in past tense, which makes me think that his father is no longer around. But Kieran shares with Hart the bedtime story his father would share with him about a monster who lived amongst his people, of course referring to Tula, point of the story being that you should never trust a Harkonnen. Now Hart advises that he takes revenge for his fallen family members, but Kieran continues to stand his ground and refuses to testify against the Sisterhood because of his hatred towards Hart and the Emperor. Now I need to know in the comments below, are you all thinking like me in that Albert Atreides may still be alive, or if Kieran might have any direct family members that are still alive and we might meet them in season 2. Now cut to Kieran, who's now back in suspension, as we see Nez tries to release him but is stopped by her mother. Now Nez tries to convince her mother to let Kieran go and calls back to their conversation from the first episode, and in return she'll never see him again, but the Empress instead has her arrested as a lesson about power as Nez is taken away. Now this taking a moment to thinking about Nez and how this whole story is about broken families and how you can't choose your family. Just thinking about how Nez just recently lost the trust in her brother, her father, and now her mother. She really has no reason to believe that she's a part of that family anymore. And again, it almost shares a similar storyline to Valia in a way. Now we cut to the Emperor and Francesca, as it's confirmed in this moment that Constantine has indeed left to command his new fleet, as it is time for her to go back to her responsibilities, but the Emperor suggests that she stay with him at the palace. The Emperor tells her that the Empress is well aware of their relationship and he's tired of this pretend life that he's been living with her, as he requests to speak to the Mother Superior about how him and Francesca can now be together officially and publicly. Now this gets interrupted by the news of Nez being recently arrested. Now going back to that conversation, is it me or did it sound like he was maybe promised that him and Francesca would be together at some point by Valia? Again, this being another example of how much power and influence she had over him. Francesca shares what happened to Nez with Valia, and she knows that they must act quickly before something happens to her, especially around Hart. Now it's here that Francesca realizes the message from the Emperor about her replacing the Empress as queen. Now, Valia immediately shuts down any conversation about this possibility as she calls Francesca naive. She basically explains how a move like that can put the whole Imperium on a course to war. Now, we briefly talked about this in last week's breakdown, but I do just find it so interesting to know that the sisterhood has their different rules around motherhood, but also how they handle relationships with possible lovers. Again, it makes me think about the future where Leto and Lady Jessica couldn't get married, and I believe what happens later to Francesca and the Emperor set the precedent for the way that these romantic relationships between the sisters and the royal men leaders are somewhat forbidden, besides obviously giving birth being a part of the breeding process. Now, Valia tells her that the Emperor's time of ruling has met its expiration date as Valia goes over the details of Theodosia with a plan to free the princess, and it's time to change tactics. Now, it's here where she tells Francesca that it's time to kill the Emperor, as Francesca says that he is the father of her son and doesn't outright say no, but it's clear that she's against this idea. Now again, with them being close friends, we see Valia tells her that she's sorry, but she knew that this day would eventually come. Now again, this reaffirms my feelings about how, yes, Francesca and maybe other sisters who are put in these positions, and going back to Lady Jessica that we saw in the films with Leto, their task with being in these romantic relationships are part of the sisterhood's plans. But eventually, it seems like some of them actually fall in love, and that kind of makes sense. But unfortunately, once that particular male of power ever gets out of line or is deemed to be uncontrollable, the decision about their life coming to an end seems to be destined even without that particular sister's consent in the ultimate decision. As we saw what happened with Leto in the films, and later we see what happens to Haviko. Now it's here that we flash back to where Valia shows Tula, Kasha, and Francesca of Mother Raquela's life's work with the thinking machine's assistant in the breeding process. Now Tula sees this and is completely against this idea as she speaks of the horrific experience with humans versus AI, but Valia shows them just how powerful and valuable this system is, as they call it Anaru. Now, I don't know if this is a coincidence or if this is canon to the lore of Dune, but the name given to the machine happens to be the same name of a member of later called the Bene Gesserit, Lady Adarun Carino, who happens to be the mother of Princess Irulan Carino. As Valia demonstrates the machine's abilities to find in them the union that they need, this is where we see young Haviko and Natalia, who possesses the traits of producing a child that the sisterhood can mold into one of them, and that of course being Nez. Now funny enough, it's Francesca who brings up the unforeseen uncertainties about assuring this match, as we see the newly appointed Mother Superior Valia working her magic, and she's planting the idea of Francesca imprinting on him to set the path of having a sister on the throne as the Empress. Now again, Tula is showing signs of uncertainty, and this is where Valia has the other sisters leave for they can speak privately amongst themselves. Now this is where Valia shows her sister in this moment that the Atreides and the Harkonnens bloodlines have never crossed paths before until now, as she actually shows Tula her unborn son. Now again, Valia working her magic of words, she shares the incredible potential her unborn child will have, and he even has the ability to change the course of worlds, but he'll require the right amount of guidance to reach his full potential. I don't know guys, does it sound like anyone you know from the future by the name of Paul Atreides? Now going back to that scene, it is just so fascinating to me just how much power a child born of both bloodlines, Harkonnens and Atreides, can be. Now I want to know from my book readers in the comments below, is there an explanation in the books to why crossing those bloodlines creates such a potential force that can either be a gift or a curse to the universe? Now yet again, we see just how perfect Valia is in influencing people, but specifically her siblings. We saw it with Griffin, and now we see it again with Tula. Now at the same time, she knows just how to make it appear like she's actually being a supportive sister at first, but from what we've seen from her in this show, we know that she also sees the potential of the soon-to-be nephew of hers and knows he can be a tool for the sisterhood, but more importantly, be a tool for Valia. But I do want to point out, it is in this scene that you can tell that Tula understands and sees through her sister's optimistic support, and she knows that she has to keep her child from her sister. Now cut back to present day where Tula is speaking to Anaru about analyzing what Sister Nazir was referring to before she died. As we watch, Anaru suggest to Tula that this inhuman machine is working on a nanoscale. Now Tula is very adamant that her son wasn't born a weapon, but instead he was made into one, as she sets her sights on going to go see her son Desmond Hart for the first time since he was a little baby. Now back with the sisterhood, we see Sister Emmeline overhears that Mother Tula is gone, as we cut to seeing Jen and Lila. Now Lila awakes to restraints and requests that they get removed because of her time that she spent in the tank, and she also feels like she's being treated as a criminal. Now we watch as Lila puts on this innocent act to convince Jen to help her, which she does, as my theory comes to fruition as it's revealed that Lila is actually now being controlled by her grandmother Dorothea and uses the sedative that Tula gave her in the last episode to knock Jen out. Now quick side note, because it isn't mentioned in this episode, but something I hope is explored more in season 2 is the reveal of Lila's parents. And the reason I bring this up is because I think about Dorothea. She was so committed to the sisterhood, it makes me wonder, when was she have had time to, number one, have a child without it being a part of the plan that Raquel had with the whole breeding process? Like, it makes me think, was Lila a mistake from Dorothea's daughter? Again, was Dorothea's daughter in the sisterhood? Are Lila's parents even still alive? Again, I'm assuming that her mother, Lila's mother, was a part of the sisterhood, because if you all remember back, and I want to say in episode 2 or whatever the episode was when Lila took the agony, we had heard Tula say that she knew her mother. So I'm assuming that she was a part of the sisterhood. But again, I hope that this is explored more and fleshed out more in season 2. Now from here we cut to seeing Sister Emmeline congregating with her followers, as to their surprise we see Lila appears. Now it's here where Dorothea learns the coming reckoning to the sisterhood, and again we get to see the brilliance on display from a performance standpoint by Chloe, who's just doing such a great job of mimicking the similar characteristics of the actress who played Dorothea. But I also really enjoyed the writing in this scene, as Lila, aka Dorothea, return is being used as like a double meaning, where she says that her return is despite the efforts of others, as she's looking for Valia, who we know is her sworn enemy, as she learns that she is now referred to as Mother Superior Valia, as she also learns about the debanning of her previous followers after her suicide, which after hearing that, she knows that that's not true and that's not the cause of her death, which clearly upsets her. Now during all this, we cut to Jen, who's in panic mode, but for the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, for the first time this season, we see her using the lessons of the sisterhood as she concentrates and she puts herself through the pain and the fear, and she puts that aside as she breaks her thumbs to release herself. Now back with Dorothea, we see her gathering the files of the Midtat sisters to find the location of her faithfuls as Jen walks in. Now Jen doesn't go into details, but she tries to warn Emmeline that this isn't Lila, but Emmeline knows, and she quickly realizes that this is the sister she's been admiring her whole time at the sisterhood in Mother Dorothea. Now after looking up the information, she learns that her followers are no longer around and they're actually been erased from the records by Valia. Which, speaking of, we see Valia and Francesca as she explains in a very kind of Mission Impossible type of way, where she's explaining the plan to her, and as an audience we're watching the plan as it shakes out. Now the plan is to have Valia get arrested in order to free Nez, and Theodosia's going to help by using her face dancing skills. Now Francesca sees the weapon that's going to be used to kill the Emperor, as it's coated with metacyanine, which will be a quick and painless death, and of course she's tasked to doing this job, as she states, sisterhood above all. Now again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, and we'll talk about this more in detail a little bit later, but notice every time they say sisterhood above all is when they're about to kill somebody. Now the weapon that's referred to in that previous scene will later be called the Gom Jabbar, as is known as the high-handed enemy, which happens to be the name of this episode, and as you would imagine, it is a handheld needle tapped with the metacyanine poisoning. As you all will remember the famous scene in Dune with Paul Atreides being introduced to this very needle. Now back with Hart, which by the way, the silver case that I have on the screen now, anyone in the comments know if this has any significance to Hart? Have we seen him use this before and I'm just not remembering it? Let me know in the comments below, but we have the Emperor confronting him about his involvement of his daughter's recent arrest. Now Hart explains to the Emperor that he should discuss this with his wife because she was the one that made the decision, but Nez was the one who ultimately tried to free the traitor of the Imperium. Now, of course, the Emperor doesn't want to believe these actions of her daughter, but he mentions to Hart that he's actually going to be sending his wife, the Empress, to be sent away on this tour of goodwill on the behalf of the Imperium. Now, Hart immediately calls the Emperor out on this, knowing that the Emperor just wants to spend more time with Francesca. As Hart tells the Emperor about the sister's involvement in his assassination attempt with Francesca's knowledge, but again, the Emperor refuses to acknowledge Hart's admissions. Now, the Emperor takes this opportunity to remind Hart of his complicated relationship with Mother Superior, and he's considering bringing her back into the fold. And I know this show is very serious, there's not a lot of levity, but I personally was laughing so hard at seeing Hart's reaction to the Emperor telling him this, because as he's putting his head in his hands, I just know he wanted to curse out the Emperor and call him every name in the book. But ultimately, we see Hart takes this as the Emperor choosing Valia's advice over his, which after everything he's done, we see just how upset this made Hart, and we know that after what happened in the last episode in the final scene with him and the Empress, this kind of pushed Hart on the edge to really join forces with her. Now, next we see the Empress has already learned of what the Emperor has planned for her. She tells her husband that won't be happening as Hart appears in the room. Now, Hart shows the Emperor where his loyalty now lies, as the Emperor is flabbergasted as his wife tells him that he will remain Emperor, but he will no longer ignore her and basically serve as her puppet. Obviously, we know as an audience the Emperor has been used as a puppet for so long for others, but for the character, this is his first time fully being aware of it. Cut to Valia entering the throne room as we see the Emperor outside catching his breath after the recent encounter as he learns that Mother Superior has arrived. Now he walks into the throne room to finding Valia sitting on his throne as she tells him that she's here to clarify their positions. First and foremost, Valia on the throne, very, very bold move. But surprisingly, the Emperor is so happy to see her. He tells her that he needs her help and he wants Hart to be removed and he wants to go back to their old arrangement and he doesn't want to be a puppet to his wife and Hart. I just really love this scene and I love this moment because we see some personality in the older version of Valia, which we really haven't seen in this series so far, but she doesn't seem like the person that is going to like to rebuild a broken trust or broken bridges made, as she proceeds to tell him just exactly what's been going on. Valia tells the Emperor that he has never been free and calls him weak, and she reveals that his entire life has basically been scripted by the Sisterhood before he was even born. He's made no major decisions in his life, and he's basically just an assignment. Now she goes even further and reveals the fact that Francesca never loved him and it's his daughter that's of the utmost importance, not him, and his time is up. Now clearly this upsets the Emperor and he instructs his guards to arrest her, and immediately you notice the guards kind of hesitate because it's almost as though they don't even trust the Emperor's own orders in the moment. Now at first I was thinking to myself, is this some type of Sisterhood mind trick like reverse psychology? But then I quickly remembered this is all a part of Valia's plan to get arrested so she can get Nez. Now realistically, Valia could have maybe said like half of those nasty things to get herself arrested, but I am to believe that she added those more personal touches as like a punishment to remind him that she's in charge, but to also, Valia seems to be a very petty person. She did this like in a form of payback for him betraying her and choosing Hart over her, as the sisters' knife cuts very deep, but their truths behind their words cut even deeper. Now back at the Sisterhood, as Dorothea walks in the garden area, she starts to recall where she died and she slowly begins to replay that night as she had the voice being used on her by Valia. Now, fueled by anger, and rightfully so, we see Dorothea shows them the truth about who their Mother Superior Valia really is, as she breaks into one of the exterior walls to remove the water in a well to reveal the truth. Now, we'll be discussing what's discovered here in a second, but I want you all to remember, and this goes back to a callback of episode 4, when the sisters began drawing their nightmares, their shared nightmares, you'll recall that some of the sisters drew a well, and somebody drew someone falling, as we find out exactly what Dorothea is about to show them and showing the connections of what that drawing meant and how it's now coming to fruition. Now here we cut to another flashback where Valia tells Dorothea's followers what really happened to her. Now most of them are immediately seeing that this is being a lie being told to them by Valia, as we see Valia and the sisters try to convince them at first with a more reasonable approach, but it unfortunately fails. Now in response, Valia takes a more aggressive approach by having them choose between life and joining together as sisters or death. As we watch Valia, Francesca, and Kasia, who now know how to use the voice, they make Dorothea's followers choose as we watch them cut their own own throats as a way of picking their choice. And at the last minute, we see Tula eventually joins. Now, the only one to survive this is Sister Avila, who vows to never reveal this secret. Now, to me, her surviving speaks so much volumes to her never taking the agony to actually become a mother. Sister Avila most likely lost her faith in the sisterhood with Valia leading the sisterhood, and probably couldn't leave because Valia would most likely kill her in fear that she's going to reveal her secret. It's almost like she was a prisoner in the sisterhood for all these years. In this moment, it really makes you kind of rethink about Sister Avila. To me personally, she was someone that came off like a hater and someone that I really wasn't a fan of, but now having seen this flashback, it just adds so much context to her character. Now, I can't go without talking about that moment. That just completely caught me off left field. Like, my goodness, what an extremely dark and terrifying moment. They literally killed the sisters and really started from scratch after this. Now, I am very curious to know if this is something that might be explored in season 2, but it appears that once you pledge to be a sister, you leave everything behind, including your family, and you may never speak to them again or hear from them again. But again, I am curious to know if any one of those murdered sisters' family members have ever reached out, and if so, could they be looking for answers to what happened to their daughters? But again, this reveal just adds so much context to characters. Just thinking about Dorothea and like how she never got past what happened to her. And I mean, you know why, even in death, because this whole sisterhood was built and operated on one thing, and that is them being attacked by the idea of fear and being forged in bloodshed. And again, I just can't move past that scene because it was such a crazy reveal, but I feel like younger Valia is far more frightening than the older version of herself. I'm not saying in a negative way, I just really mean like the younger version of her is just terrifying. Now, I've said this before, that we were led to believe, at least 2 episodes in, that Tula was so kind, but obviously episode 3 changed that and really showed her true colors, and she even speaks to that later in this finale. But now seeing Kasha and Francesca, again, characters that I'm just going to speak for myself, I thought they were kind, I thought they were, level-headed individuals, but come to find out, they're just as brutal and vicious. And I want to be clear, they've made these violent decisions on their own, and they chose to go down that path, but it wasn't without the guidance of Valia. This was the moment I realized how this really puts a new context on the real meaning of the particular characters who have been saying this season, sisterhood above all. That meant something different to these 4 horsemen ladies, and their group was really the real sisterhood they've always spoke of. And these were the secrets that Tula spoke of all the way back in episode 2. After that death flashback, we cut to Francesca, who's awaiting the Emperor, who's upset about finding out what he just did from Valia. Now, he tells her what Valia told him, and in return, we get a surprise from her as she reveals the poison needle and basically says that it's Valia's plan, never hers, basically choosing him over the sisterhood. Now, from one character choosing love over the sisterhood, we cut to Kieran, who finds Nez is being held next to him as Valia arrives to release her. Now, Valia kills the guards with the help of Theodosia, who's now going to be covering as Nez with her shape-shifting abilities, as Nez refuses to leave without Kieran. Now, Theodosia will buy them some time, something I theorized in my last video as they make their escape plan. Now, I'm going to talk about this scene here for a second. This is an example to me of a little payoff that works from a few episodes back where Valia had planned for Theodosia and Nez to grow close together and become friends or whatnot. But this is an example to me of the lack of numbers of this episode, right? And maybe setting this moment up to have more of an impact. Now, what I mean by that is if we would have had more episodes to flesh out things like this, imagine if Nez and Theodosia really did have more time to develop more, and Nez thinking that she and Theodosia are becoming friends, all to learn in this scene that she's just been a part of a contingency plan, which in return could have opened Nez to seeing the true intentions of the sisterhood and how they really work. And again, this moment would have just been more impactful if we would have just had more time to flesh out that relationship. Now, during all this, we hear the Empress talking to Hart about their plans to accusing the sisterhood of attempting the assassination of an emperor, but in comes the guards to tell them about Valia's arrest. But again, this is very important because it's going to frame what the Empress does a little little bit later. Now, as Hart instructs a full lockdown on the palace, he's stopped by an injured guard who's whispering something. Now, as he gets closer, he gets stabbed, and we know it's Theodosia who's taken that soldier's form. Now, Theodosia is knocked out, and she returns back to her normal form as Hart instructs the guards to put her in a holding cell, which is leaving her alive, which makes me so happy because I would love to explore more of her species, but also seeing more face dancers come season 2. Now, back with Francesca and the Emperor, he draws a knife on her, not believing that she's on his side. Now, she tells him that the imprint won't allow him to harm her as she tries to de-escalate the situation, but instead, he tells her that it's kind of strange, this thing that's going on right now, to him realizing that he's really never experienced a really true moment of freedom. But now is his time to make a change and to make a decision of his own as we see him stab himself. Yet another crazy reveal that I did not anticipate happening, the Emperor taking his own life, and it just speaks so much to the character. Like, after learning that he had no idea his life was completely orchestrated and planned out with his knowledge, he would rather die than to be a part of this falsehood. Now again, rest in peace to the Emperor, man. Like, I did not anticipate that happening, but despite the lack of authority and him being a weak man and a weak leader overall as an emperor, I couldn't help but to think about the similarities of his story and how it kind of reminds me of the same one of House of the Dragon, and I'm referring to King Viserys Targaryen. Again, if you've seen that show, you can see the similarities of these men who are just kind of weak, but behind that is most likely a good person put in a bad situation. They both were manipulated and betrayed by those that they thought that they can trust. Now, let's talk about this briefly in the comments below. Personally, I feel bad for the Emperor, but let me know how you all feel. Do you feel bad? Do you not care? Let's have that conversation in the comment section. Now, going back to the scene, as the Emperor slowly dies, as Francesca begs for him to stay with her, in comes the jealous Empress, who takes the needle and uses it on Francesca as she watches her husband and the mistress both die on top of each other. Now, going back to that scene that I mentioned earlier with the Emperor's plan, well, she takes this opportunity as she begins screaming that the Emperor has been killed, and it's pretty safe to assume that she's going to now blame Francesca of the murder of the Emperor, and it was on the behalf of the sisterhood. Now, speaking about things I didn't anticipate in this finale, I did not expect to see both of these characters dying in the finale. What a major plot to build on for next season. Will other royal families immediately lock up or maybe kill their truthsayers in fear of their lives? What will Constantine do once he learns that both of his parents are now dead? How will the sisterhood prove their innocence in all this? Even though the Emperor dying was Valya's intentions, I guess the sisterhoods could say that that was part of her plan. They had nothing to do with that. But more importantly, who will now sit on the throne? Now, going back to the sisterhood, Dorothea unearths the truth by showing the sisters the remains of the fallen sisters that we saw forced to choose their life, and now they're just skeletons that were thrown away like trash, as she tells them that Valya murdered them. Now, Jen tells Sister Avila to tell Tula about this, but we know she knows Tula was a part of this, as she has Mother Dorothea leading the way to return the sisters back to their righteous path, as she leads them to the breeding archives to show them just how deep this corruption goes, as we watch Dorothea destroys the thinking machine and destroying her grandmother's life's work. Now, we don't see any more of the sisterhood for the rest of this episode, but I want to briefly talk about them here for a second. This was easily the most interested I've personally been in this subplot. I'm not saying it was bad or terrible, but it definitely was lower on my personal interest of this show, and I believe it was mostly highlighted this week because, like last week, we have more of Lila, and to me, she's truly the strongest amongst the younger actors in this show, and particularly in those scenes, and just really shifted the tone and the direction of the show. And I thought that she did such a great job in this particular episode, and just across the board, I thought that this particular subplot just really worked for me in this finale. Now, we flash back to Tula recently having given birth to Hart as she makes her tough choice. She knows her sister will only use him as a tool and a weapon once he comes of age, so Tula gives him the freedom of not being a victim of the sisterhood. Now, we come to find out that Francesca actually played a role in this plan, which goes to show that she actually didn't completely always agree with Valya, kept things like this from her, and it kind of speaks to the adult version of Francesca going against Valya by picking the Emperor over killing him, as Francesca brought brought a stillborn baby to replace Hart to make Valia believe that the baby didn't make it after the pregnancy, as we watch her make the exchange and hold the stillborn in her arms. Now I gotta point this out, man, this is some really good emotional stuff in this moment, but I also want to speak about this maybe being explored further in a season 2. The story goes that Francesca found this woman who was expecting to have a stillborn, and in exchange they were going to give obviously the stillborn to Francesca so they can make the exchange with Desmond Hart, and it was said that the woman has kind eyes. Right? She said that she was kind, but she specifically said that she had kind eyes. Now, we know the importance of eyes throughout this entire series. It's very, very important to the show. The way that they use that, like, why does she have to say she had, I know that's like a gesture that people say they have kind eyes, indicating they're a kind person. But again, knowing the significance of how eyes play a part in this series, I wonder if we'll learn who raised Hart, if there's anything to do with him being who he becomes in the show, because we know Hart says that he came from a place where it was like scavengers. He had to fight for his life. But again, I'm very curious to know who was his mother. Was there a father involved? Are they still alive? And again, are they responsible for who Hart becomes in this show? Now, something else I want to point out in this scene, I could be mistaken, but you notice how baby Hart was covered in that black blanket or like that cloth that was in all black. I wonder if some of that black material is the same one we see him holding closely in what seems to be something he cherished, like in a form of a remembrance of his childhood, as we saw him holding. It was in the very first scene that we saw him being introduced in episode 1, and we also saw him using it in episode 5. But going back to the decision that we saw Tula making, it really does put a new perspective on the character in a sense of like how she saw Lila, a child that was parentless, and she wanted to take care of her, which was something she wasn't able to do with her own child that she had to abandon to protect him from her sister. As we cut back to present day, as we see Tula entering the atmosphere to go see her son. Now, this was a brief scene, but this was a scene that definitely sets up something more for season 2. And yet again, a theory that I had predicted, as we cut to seeing Harrow, who is now being revealed to have been spying on Valia in her private meetings with the technology that Hart gave him back in episode 5 as a gift. As is revealed that he recorded the entire conversation, which entailed the entire plan with how they're going to kill the Emperor and Nez's escape plan. Which to me goes back to what Karen said earlier in the episode, proving that you really can't trust a Harkonnen. Now my question is, did he do this on his own, having like his own contingency plan or like a way of blackmailing Valia, or is this him choosing a side? Did he choose the Empress and Hart and portraying his aunt? Again, another plot that I'm very interested in seeing being fleshed out more in season 2. Now back with Valia, Karen, and Nez, they land at a fuel station as Valia will buy them some time for Karen to take Nez to safety, as we get to see the Mother Superior in action. As the soldiers draw their swords, we see Valia kills one, has another defend her by killing one of their own, and instructs the others to kill Hart. Which I gotta say, this just goes to show how powerful sisters can be and how they can use the voice. Really badass scene to me. But even though he was wounded, we watch Hart, he's still able to handle his own as he kills the soldiers, leaving a face-off between Hart and Valia. Now Valia tells him to show her the end that he spoke of about her, as he listens and shows her by using his abilities, as we see a thumper on Arrakis as they both fall to their knees. Now cut to Valia experiencing her nightmare, which takes her back to Lincolnville, her home planet, to the time that Griffin was drowning, as we see her screaming for him to swim. Now meanwhile, we see Tula arrives and she sees both Kieran and Nez on the run, but her inner thoughts, the foremothers, tell her that that's the workings of her sister Valia's influence and that she should let them pass and go find her sister Valia. Now we do get another action scene, which I did enjoy the action in this finale, as we see Nez using those skills that she learned from Karen as they're going back to back, taking out the soldiers as they will be patiently awaiting Valia to meet them at the rendezvous. Back with Tula, she finds her sister and tells her that she can't fight this because it's a machine, as we see this look of concern on her face because she also sees that her wounded son is on the floor. Now this nightmare of Valia is having all stems from fear of being back at home but also losing Griffin, as Tula tries to bring her back like she did when she took the agony, and just like that time, she does bring her back by telling her that she has to let the fear go and tonight fight back against the machine. Before getting out of this nightmare, we see she gets a message from her brother who tells her that she is responsible for killing him and she's going to kill them all, which can be foreshadowing for next season. Now Valia comes face to face with the worm as she's taken to Arrakis as it approaches and consumes her into the blue light. By the way, incredible work by the visual department's team. Like, this entire scene was like visually very impressive. But now is the moment where we finally figure out what the blue glowing eyes mean. So we cut to seeing Hart's point of view as he's awakened on this operational table to a thinking machine with, here we go, the blue lights at the center of it as it's performing the procedure to implant the nanoscale virus into Hart's eye as we watch him seize that someone's watching him, which again speaks to those nightmares about someone's watching. It's the eyes, the blue light, it's all being explained. Now, honestly, I thought that the show, once they announced the season 2 before the finale happened, I thought that this was going to be held to be explained in season 2. But again, we finally understand why Hart and all the victims and the nightmares saw the same thing. It was, again, Hart, what he saw in his operation. Now, of course, there is plenty of unanswered questions surrounding this whole procedures, like the details involving, including who explained to Hart just how to use the virus. But the one biggest question is, we don't see who found him and used him as the bioweapon. Now, based on the unfocused viewpoint of Hart during this scene, we can definitely see that there is a person there and they are standing in front of an orange light behind them, which basically to me indicates that they're on the planet of Arrakis, as we know that he was consumed by the worm on Arrakis, so it makes sense that they're still on Arrakis, but it looks like they have a hood on. Now, is this a similar design as far as clothing to the Sisterhood's hood? Could be, but I don't think it's a sister. I'm still very much in the belief, if you see my videos these past 6 weeks, that Vorian Atreides is 100% still alive, and or it could be Albert Atreides, or maybe both of them. But again, I feel confident that Vorian will be a part of season 2, and he will be like a driving force of season 2, either Vorian or Albert Atreides or both. They are maybe, I'm 99% sure that they are the ones behind creating or resurrecting Desmond Hart. Now, back with the sisters, Valia tells Tula what she saw and how she couldn't make out who's behind this, but knows that the virus is in Hart's eye and she's prepared to cut it out. But Mother Tula steps in, stops her sister by using a voice on her, something that I would imagine Valia has never experienced before. Now, here's what Tula reveals that Hart is her son. Valia, of course, feels betrayed, and she was under the impression that the baby was stillborn from the flashback that we saw, as Tula explains that she had to protect him from her. Now, Tula admits that they are two of the same. They're two wolves born to feed, no matter at the cost. Now, to briefly reflect on this moment and knowing how things played out in the flashbacks, I do think that Valia is definitely hurt by this idea that Tula thought less of her and that she would have taken advantage of her baby. Now, personally, I'm 90% sure that Tula made the right decision in giving up her child, because I do think Valia would have used Hart when he became the right age. But that other 10% of me, is there a possibility that she could have just loved the child as a nephew and just raised him normally? Again, we'll never know. But again, he's family. So again, she seems to treat certain family members like Tula and Griffin like she loves them. Let me know in the comments below what could have happened. Do you all think that Valia would have used Hart as a child or once he came of age? Or do you think she would have been a nice auntie to her nephew and raised him just to be normal? Let me know your thoughts about that in the comments below. Now, Valia points out the fact that their enemies saw Hart's potential and the machine saw this and harnessed his abilities, as Valia wants to put an end to this and put an end to him, but Tula knows he's a victim and wants her sister to allow her to save her son and fix this if she'll trust her to do so. Now, we watch as Valia withdraws her blade. She didn't kill either Tula or her nephew Hart, and she allows Tula to do as she wishes, but she reminds her that the reckoning is still coming. Valia is very aware of this new hand in the game and heads off to find them scheming in the shadows. Now, during this whole confrontation, we know Hart heard all of this. He now knows who his mother is, and initially when Tula's going in for a hug, we see him kind of being resistant, but he does embrace his mother for the very first time, and we see this really nice cutscene here when she sees him as a little boy again, and she remembers that time that she gave him the freedom, and unfortunately, this turned against her, because knowing that she is his mother, this doesn't stop him from having her get arrested. Which to me, this sets up, obviously we know Theodosia is going to be in the prison cell, and I would imagine Theodosia and Tula will be in the same holding cell. Potentially, they can maybe separate them, but this also sets up the inevitable conversation between mother and son. Going back to the actual scene, I thought there were some great performances by that trio of actors in that moment. Like, I really felt the sisters back and forth, and I really did feel the emotions between Tula and her son Desmond Hart. As we end this finale in space, where we find a ship headed into Arrakis, and again, shout out to the production of the show, because this, I know some people complain that it doesn't feel like the world of Dune, and of course, you know, Denis Villeneuve, they have a much bigger budget than the show had, but when we go to Arrakis, it looked like the Arrakis from the films, obviously 10,000 years into the past, but it looked really clean, and very curious to know, like, the production going from all these different planets of, you know, Lankaville and the capital, but now they're going to be maybe mainly on Arrakis come season 2, but nonetheless, very impressed by the production team and the scouting team of finding this location. As they land, we see Valia, Kieran, and Nez, which, by the way, a Harkonnen, an Atreides, and a Carino, all working together, as this is the path to finding their enemy. Man, what a massive episode. So let's wrap this thing up, because I am very thirsty, like I'm on Arrakis. But anyway, thoughts on the episode. Getting the negatives out of the way first, and I'm going to be honest with you all, I'm not saying this was flawless, I'm not saying this is perfect television, but considering the announcement of season 2 earlier in the week, I feel as though that we got the answer that we needed, but at the same time, they set up a lot of things to be explored in season 2. I really don't have many flaws in this episode. Like, this felt like I was watching a Dune movie. Like, this was almost an hour and a half. It was epic, it was emotional, it was surprising, it was shocking, and again, it sets up things like the sisterhood now being under this new leadership of Dorothea, but Lila's still inside, and I believe Jen's going to be the one to maybe bring her out, but I do feel like, though, Dorothea is going to be like mainly using Lila for most of season 2, if not all of season 2 potentially. But again, season 2 also sets up one of the biggest issues with the sisterhood is they no longer have thinking technology to their accessibility. Of course, we know that the sisters still use this breeding system in the future, but what's going to happen now as far as how they're going to operate, and what's going to happen in regards to how they're going to be moving forward with the new leader of Dorothea? Of course, we have an emperor who's now dead, so Ned's no longer in line of the empress. Constantine commanding the flight, like what's going to happen with him? It's safe to assume that Natalia will be sitting on a throne and Hart by her side. And of course, you can't forget about characters like Theodosia, who is now going to be with Tula, and they're going to probably be working together. And of course, she's going to try to reconnect with her son. We have Michaela, who's still out there somewhere. And of course, we have to find out who's the enemy that created Hart. All things that I am excited to explore in season 2, on top of learning new characters, you know, Gulas and all the different lore and the mythology in Dune. So I'm really excited about season 2. So overall, I've seen and heard the dislikes of people that are, I'm not trying to put people in a box, but I've seen a lot of the criticism come from people that have read the books and they feel like the show didn't do the books justice. And again, I get how some people come from that perspective. Like, there's certain things that I'm connected to from like a comic book perspective, and when I see a film or a show that doesn't really as faithful to the source material, it can be frustrating. But again, from someone that hasn't read the books, but from someone that's watched the films, loves the films, and I've done, you know, research of the Dune universe, I'm just speaking to my experience. I really enjoyed this show. Like, I had such a fun time exploring more of this world and these characters, and I was so fascinating with the Bene Gesserit in the Dune films, but now to get this perspective of their origins and their sisterhood, again, I thoroughly enjoyed this series. Yes, I wish we had more episodes to spend time fleshing out characters and relationships. For example, I've said it before, and I felt like the acolytes and the sisters, like the whole training subplot, wasn't as strong for me, besides the incredible performance by Chloe Lee as Sister Lila. But I also didn't think the love story between Nez and Karen was as strong as the show wants us to believe. And that's just me personally. But again, the positives of the actual main story outweighed the negatives in my opinion. And the main story being the story of the Harkonnen sisters, Valia and Tula. And I mean both version of the characters. And again, not to compare this to House of the Dragon, but there's a lot of similarities to me, even though I know Dune came before this. But I think about young Rhaenyra and Alicent, and like how the young actors were just as good as the older actors and they complemented each other. Same could be said about this show. The younger versions of Valia and Tula and the older versions, they were just such on the same page. It was like a symbiotic relationship. I felt the performance. I love the details of the character development throughout the entire series from both sets of characters. And while their actions were nothing short of villainous, I think it's more than just black and white. Both characters definitely played in the gray, and while I don't condone their actions, I think the show did a really great job of exploring the reasons behind their decisions that they made throughout this season. Again, this felt like Dune to me, but of course from another perspective, and from my experience with the films that I love so near and dear, I thought the 6 episodes of the show has really grown to really be something I enjoyed, and I'm beyond excited to see season 2 has in store. Now the question is, which comes first, season 2 or Dune Messiah? Let me know your thoughts and predictions on that in the comments below. So before I wrap up, I have maybe 1 or 2 more videos coming as it pertains to the show before we officially retire, before getting the news of season 2. So make sure to keep an eye out for those videos coming soon. But with that being said, thank you all for watching this massive video. Like, I don't know what's the length of this video before I edit it all out. But if you watch it from beginning to the end, I really appreciate you. But also, I want to take the time to thank everyone that's been watching these videos since, episode 1. I know there are some great content creators out there, people that are much more versed in the Dune universe that covers this show. So the fact that you all have been watching my videos, whether it's from day 1 or this is your first time watching the video, I really do want to take the time to thank you. So please leave all your thoughts, opinions, theories, deeper meanings, and everything you all took away from this episode. And of course, let me know your overall thoughts of the season, favorite episode, favorite character, things that worked, things that didn't work. And of course, what do you all hope to see in season 2? Please support this video by liking the video, sharing this video, but more importantly, consider sticking around by subscribing to the channel and hitting that bell notification. Don't forget, you all are awesome, stay safe, and I'll catch you all on the next breakdown.